Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd done it before, but not in this area. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a night or two. I just wanted to clear my head, get away from all the noise back home. I picked a remote spot, pretty deep in the woods, far from any main trails, thinking it would give me some peace. The first night was fine. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and settled in with some basic supplies. It was quiet, just the usual forest sounds around me. I went to bed early, expecting it to be like any other trip. But in the morning, I woke up to find my stuff scattered everywhere. My food was gone, the bag torn open, and the rest of my things looked like they'd been rummaged through. I figured it was some animal, a raccoon or maybe a fox, searching for food. I wasn't thrilled, but it wasn't a big deal. I'd brought extra food, so I could stay another night. I cleaned up the mess, packed my things back up, and decided to take a hike to clear my head. I was out most of the day, exploring the area, getting lost in my own thoughts. By the time I got back to camp, it was already late afternoon. I started up a fire again, had a small meal, and settled in for the evening. It wasn't until I went to get some water from a nearby stream that I noticed something odd. There were these little shapes, arranged in a strange pattern near my tent, made out of twigs. They were small, maybe the size of my hand, but they looked deliberate. Someone had put them there. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured some other camper had passed through and left them. But it did make me feel a little uneasy. I brushed them aside, figuring they were harmless, and went back to the fire. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. But that night, I woke up again, sometime around 3 a.m., to a rustling sound outside my tent. It was faint but steady, like someone was slowly moving around just outside. My heart started pounding. I lay there, barely breathing, just listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, then started again, this time moving closer to where I was. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't like an animal rummaging around, it was more tearful. It was like someone was purposefully avoiding making too much noise, but slipping up just enough that I could catch it. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, my eyes wide open, staring at the thin fabric of the tent. The footsteps got closer, and I could see a shadow moving along the side of the tent. It paused right near where my head was, then moved around to the other side. After a few minutes, the sound faded, and everything was quiet again. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, just listening, too scared to even sit up. When the first light started breaking through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and looked around. There was no one there. But when I stepped outside, I noticed more of those twig symbols, all around my campsite this time, in a tight circle around my tent. They were larger now, more elaborate, and each one looked a little different, almost like they were part of a set. It wasn't just random sticks thrown together. It looked like someone had taken their time, arranging each one carefully. My stomach sank. It was clear this wasn't some harmless prank by another camper. Someone had been here, had come close enough to be right outside my tent, making these things. I tried to calm myself down, told myself maybe it was just some local kids messing around. But deep down, I didn't believe it. This was too far out for anyone to just stumble upon my camp. I decided right then that I was done with this trip. I packed up as fast as I could, barely even bothering to fold my tent properly. I just shoved everything into my bag, constantly glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. It took me about an hour to get everything together, and the whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps or see someone lurking in the trees. When I was finally ready, I headed back toward the main trail, keeping my head down, focused on getting out. The woods felt different, like they were closing in on me, every little sound making me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that someone was watching every step I took. As I got closer to the edge of the woods, I stopped to catch my breath. I'd been moving fast, almost jogging, trying to get as much distance as I could. I looked back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Standing far back among the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were tall, and they just stood there, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing through the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were looking directly at me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like if I moved, they'd come after me. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to turn around and keep walking. I didn't look back again. I just kept going until I reached my car, threw my stuff in the back, and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. When I finally got home, I tried to rationalize everything that had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was overreacting. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. A few days later, I decided to go through my camping gear to put it away properly. When I opened my bag, I found one of those twig symbols, carefully tucked inside. It hadn't been there when I packed up. I was on a long drive for work and needed a place to crash. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally found this rundown motel off the main road. The sign flickered with half-burnt bulbs, and the place looked like it hadn't seen fresh paint in years. But it was the only place around, and I was dead tired. So I pulled in, grabbed my bag, and checked in. The guy at the front desk barely looked up from his paper, handing me the key without much of a word. The room was as bad as the outside. The bedspread looked worn, and there was a faint smell of mildew. But I didn't care. All I wanted was a few hours of sleep before I got back on the road. I tried to get comfortable, but it was hard to relax in that room. The walls were thin, and I could hear the faint sounds of people in other rooms, pipes creaking, and every once in a while, the hum of a car passing outside. I turned off the lights, pulled the covers up, and tried to let the noise fade into the background. Then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard a tapping sound on the window. It was light at first, almost like a gentle knock, and I thought maybe it was just a branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, more insistent, a steady tap, tap, tap. I told myself to ignore it, that it was probably nothing, but something about it felt wrong. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got up, creeping over to the window. I didn't pull back the curtain right away. I just stood there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and soft. Finally, I pulled the curtain aside just a bit, enough to see outside. There was a boy standing there, right outside my window, staring in at me. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with messy hair and big, dark eyes. He was pale, and his clothes looked old, like they didn't fit him right. He raised his hand and tapped on the glass again, looking at me with this pleading expression. I leaned down to get a better look, and he mouthed something, but I couldn't hear him through the glass. I hesitated, wondering what a kid was doing out here, all alone at this hour. My first thought was that he was lost or hurt. I reached for the latch to open the window, figuring I'd ask him what he was doing there and maybe help him find his parents or call someone. But just as my hand touched the latch, something caught my eye. Behind the boy, just on the edge of the window's view, there was a shadow, a figure, barely visible in the dark. I froze, my fingers still on the latch, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside. The figure was tall, too tall to be another kid. They were standing perfectly still, half hidden by the shadow of the building, but I could just make out the outline of their body. I couldn't see a face, just the dark shape of someone watching, waiting. They were positioned just far enough back that you'd miss them if you weren't looking closely. I looked back at the boy, who was still staring at me, still mouthing words I couldn't hear. He seemed to be getting more desperate, gesturing for me to open the window, his small hand pressing flat against the glass. But my eyes kept drifting back to that shadow, that figure lurking in the darkness, barely visible but definitely there. It clicked, all at once. This boy wasn't alone. He was being used, somehow, as bait. I don't know how I knew, but everything in me screamed not to open that window. I pulled my hand away, stepping back, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. The boy's expression changed. He went from pleading to almost angry, his brows knitting together, his mouth pressing into a thin line. He knocked harder on the glass, a steady, insistent knock that seemed louder now, echoing in the quiet room. His eyes never left mine, and it was like he knew I wasn't going to open it. I backed away from the window, my skin crawling. I didn't know what to do. Part of me felt guilty, wondering if maybe I was wrong, if this kid really did need help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I glanced around the room, trying to figure out my next move, when I heard a faint creak, like someone stepping on the gravel just outside my door. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved closer, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. Then, there was a soft scrape against the door, followed by a low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice, someone just outside, speaking in a low, calm tone. It was chilling, hearing that voice so close, knowing there was just a thin layer of wood between us. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was weak. I managed to dial 911, but it took ages for the call to go through. When someone finally picked up, I whispered that I needed help, that someone was outside my room, trying to get in. They told me to stay on the line, that they'd send someone, but it would take time. This place was out in the middle of nowhere. As I held the phone, I heard the doorknob rattle, slow at first, then harder, like someone was testing it, seeing if they could turn it. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I pressed myself back against the wall, clutching the phone, just praying they'd leave. The rattle stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe they'd gone. But then, there was a soft tap on the window again, lighter this time, like they were testing if I'd respond. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just waited, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and I heard the faint crunch of footsteps moving away from the door. I didn't dare look out the window again. I just sat there, waiting, listening as the sounds faded into the distance. I stayed like that until I saw the red and blue lights flashing through the thin curtains, and I finally felt a wave of relief wash over me. The cops didn't find anyone. They looked around the property, checked the nearby roads, but whoever it was had vanished by the time they got there. They told me it was probably a drifter, someone looking for trouble, and advised me to be more careful about where I stayed in the future. I checked out right then, got in my car, and drove for hours until I found a busy diner where I could sit and gather my thoughts. I don't know who that boy was or what that person outside wanted, but I'm just glad I didn't open that window. I worked a late shift at a cafe that stayed open until midnight, and the walk home was always the worst part of my day. Most nights it was quiet, just the usual empty streets, but I'd always feel like someone was watching me. I put it down to being tired or paranoid. I wasn't usually a nervous person, but that walk alone in the dark, it just did something to my mind. One night, close to 12:30, I left work and started my walk back. The street was completely empty, like always, just a few lights from closed shops and the occasional flickering street lamp. I put my hands in my pockets and started down the sidewalk, keeping my head down, focusing on my breathing. About halfway home, I heard something behind me, a faint echo of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my own footsteps bouncing off the buildings. I even stopped walking, just to make sure. When I stopped, the other footsteps stopped too. That's when my stomach turned cold. I couldn't see anyone behind me, but I knew someone was there. I started walking again, a little faster this time, listening closely. After a few seconds, I heard it again, the soft shuffle of steps keeping pace with mine. I didn't look back. I told myself that it was just someone walking in the same direction, going home like me. But I felt this weight pressing down on me, like something bad was just behind my shoulder. I reached the corner, turning onto a narrow street, and dared a quick glance over my shoulder. There he was, a man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe 30 feet behind. He was walking slow, too slow for someone just heading home. It was like he was matching my speed on purpose. I turned back around, my heart hammering in my chest. I kept moving, trying to act normal, but all I could think about was him following me. My mind was racing. What if he knew I noticed him? What if that made it worse? I sped up a bit, trying to keep calm. The steps behind me got faster too, like he was keeping just close enough for me to hear him. I wanted to look back, but I was too scared to. After a few blocks, I took another turn, heading down a side street, hoping I could lose him that way. The footsteps paused for a second, then picked up again, right behind me. I felt like I was being hunted. I turned again, down an alley, the kind you'd only go through if you were desperate. The alley was dark, barely lit, with tall buildings on either side. I kept moving, praying he'd pass by or get tired of this game. But when I got halfway through, I heard the footsteps stop. I turned slowly, trying to keep my breath steady. He was there, standing at the mouth of the alley, watching me. He didn't say anything, didn't try to hide that he was staring. I could see his face now, illuminated by the faint light from a street lamp. He was a stranger, but at the same time, not. I remembered him. Weeks ago, he'd come into the cafe. He'd only ordered a coffee, stayed for maybe 10 minutes, barely talked, just sat there watching me the whole time. I'd forgotten about him until now, but now I couldn't unsee it. He took a step toward me, slow and deliberate. I backed up, my hands starting to shake. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just kept moving forward. I felt trapped, knowing the only way out was past him. I tried to keep my head up, tried to act like I wasn't scared, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest. He stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could smell his stale breath. His eyes were cold, focused right on me. It was like he was waiting, watching to see what I'd do next. I couldn't just stand there. I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak. "Look, I'm just trying to go home. I don't know what you want, but please, just let me go." He tilted his head, like he was considering it, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't going to leave me alone. He took another step forward, and that's when I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I darted to the side, running past him as fast as I could, my feet pounding on the pavement. I could hear him behind me, running too, his steps echoing in the narrow alley. I ran faster, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I rounded the corner, back onto the main street, hoping he'd give up, hoping someone else would be around. But it was dead silent, not a single person in sight. I kept running, looking for any open door, any place I could duck into, but every shop was closed, the lights off. I could still hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned down another street, looking for any place to hide. I spotted a small alley between two buildings, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and darted into it. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, listening as his footsteps slowed, then stopped just outside. He was close, so close I could hear him breathing. I shut my eyes, willing myself to be invisible. He stood there, just a few feet away, and I heard him mutter something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to know he hadn't given up. I heard him step back onto the main street, his footsteps fading as he walked away, but I didn't move. I stayed pressed against the wall, waiting, my body tense, afraid he'd come back. When I finally dared to step out of the alley, I didn't see him anywhere. I stayed close to the buildings, moving as quietly as I could, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. My apartment was just a few blocks away, but those blocks felt like miles. When I finally got inside, I locked the door and slid down to the floor, my whole body shaking. I sat there in the dark for a long time, listening, waiting, afraid he'd somehow found me again. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside, every creak, made me jump. I kept seeing his face, those eyes, the way he'd stared at me like I was some kind of prize. I don't know what he wanted, or why he was following me. But I know I'll never forget that feeling, the fear of being hunted, the way he watched me, like he already knew he'd find me again. Since then, I don't work late shifts anymore. And I never walk home alone at night. I pulled off the highway around midnight, more than ready to stop driving. My eyes were starting to burn from the road, and my stomach felt like it was twisting itself in knots from the gas station snacks I'd been living on all day. I saw a small diner off to the side with a glowing neon sign, one of those classic places with old red booths and checkered floors. It was empty, as far as I could tell. Just one car in the lot, but the lights were on, so I figured it was open. I parked and headed inside. There was a tired-looking waitress wiping down a counter and some guy sitting in a booth, facing away from me. I went to the counter, ordered a coffee, and looked around. The guy in the booth had on a gray jacket and a ball cap, and he had a menu in his hands, though it didn't look like he was reading it. He was just sitting there, staring out the window. The waitress brought my coffee, and I drank it fast, letting the heat burn a bit, waking me up. Then the guy in the booth turned around and caught my eye, and he just smiled. It was an odd smile, like he recognized me, though I knew I'd never seen him before. Still, he didn't look away. He kept watching me until it got uncomfortable. He gave a little nod toward his booth, like he wanted me to join him. I hesitated, but it was late, and I figured maybe he just wanted someone to talk to. So, I picked up my coffee and walked over, sliding into the seat across from him. "Long night?" he asked. His voice was low, steady, and calm, the kind that almost puts you at ease if it weren't for the way he was looking at me. His eyes didn't move off me, even for a second. "Yeah, been on the road a while," I said, trying to keep it light. "Heading out west for a work trip." He just smiled, like he knew what I was going to say before I even opened my mouth. "You're in sales, aren't you?" he asked. I froze for a second, then forced a laugh. "Yeah, that's right. Guess I have that look, huh?" "Something like that," he replied, still smiling. He leaned back in his seat, fingers tapping on the edge of the table. You were in Nashville last week, weren't you? Selling some of those, what were they, industrial tools? My skin started to crawl. There was no way he could know that. I hadn't even told my family exactly where I'd been last week, and I sure hadn't told anyone at this diner. Yeah, that's right, I said, my voice coming out tighter than I wanted it to. You in sales too? Nah, he said, waving his hand. I just pay attention. Saw you there, that's all. I laughed a bit, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping over me. You must have a good memory, I said, still watching him. It's a big city. Oh, I don't forget faces, he replied, tilting his head. Especially when I see them more than once. Something in the way he said it set off alarms in my head. I wanted to ask more, but part of me didn't want to hear the answer. You, see me more than once? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Oh yeah, he said, nodding slowly. Saw you at that truck stop on Route 40. And again at that little motel in St. Louis. You didn't see me, but I was there. My stomach dropped, and I tried to keep my face neutral. I'd been on Route 40 a few days ago, stayed at a cheap motel in St. Louis that same night. He had every detail right. My mind was racing, trying to remember if I'd seen him before, but I couldn't place him anywhere. I kept my voice steady. That's a little strange, don't you think? He shrugged, like it was no big deal. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a coincidence, he said, leaning in close, his eyes fixed on mine. But I think we both know it's not. My palms were starting to sweat, and I forced myself to stay calm, not to let him see he was getting to me. So, what are you doing here then? Just happened to show up at the same diner as me? I tried to sound casual, but I could feel the tension building up in my chest. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking at me with that same unsettling smile. Finally, he said, maybe I like knowing where people are going. Keeps things interesting. I didn't respond, just kept staring at him, waiting. He seemed to enjoy dragging out the silence, watching my reaction. You're staying at that motel down the road tonight, aren't you? He asked, his tone almost casual. I'd planned to stay there. It was the only place close by, and I'd already booked a room earlier, before I even got off the highway. I didn't know how he could have known that. I tried to laugh it off, make a joke, but it came out shaky. You sure you're not in sales? I asked, forcing a smile. Seems like you've got a knack for information. He chuckled, but it didn't sound friendly. Nah, not sales, he said, leaning back. Just have a good eye. For details. Patterns. People. I could feel my stomach churning. I didn't know if he was bluffing, just trying to mess with me, or if he'd actually been following me. I glanced around the diner, but it was just us and the waitress, who looked half asleep. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. For you, he said. Thought you'd want a keepsake. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't help myself. I unfolded it slowly, my heart racing. It was a list of dates, places I'd stayed in the last month. Nashville, St. Louis, Little Rock. Every city, every motel. And at the bottom, tonight's date, with the name of the motel I'd booked. I pushed the paper back, feeling my hand shake. How do you know all this? I asked, barely managing to keep my voice steady. He just smiled, that same eerie smile. I told you, he said. I don't forget faces. Or patterns. I like knowing where people are going. Makes me feel connected. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I wanted to get up and leave, but I felt frozen, trapped in my seat. Then he leaned forward, his face close to mine. "I'll be seeing you," he whispered, his voice low and calm. He got up, left a few bills on the table, and walked out, not even glancing back. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I wanted to believe he was just some creep trying to mess with me, but the details he knew, they were too exact, too real. I didn't know how he'd found out, but I knew I couldn't stay at that motel. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then got up, paid for my coffee, and left. I drove a few towns over, found a different place to stay, somewhere he wouldn't expect. I didn't sleep that night, kept checking the door, listening for any sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And every time I'm on the road now, every time I pull off the highway or check into a motel, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same face, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to walk right into his path again. I don't usually go to movies alone, but it had been a rough week and I wanted a break. I picked a late night show of some indie horror flick, thinking I'd have the theater mostly to myself. It was a small, local place that usually didn't get packed, and on a weeknight, especially late, it'd probably be empty. That was what I wanted, just to sit there, alone, relax, and get lost in a story. When I got there, it was quiet. The guy behind the counter barely looked up as I bought my ticket and went in. There were maybe 3 or 4 other people scattered around, all sitting alone, each person keeping a good distance from the others. That's the nice thing about late shows, people want their space. I found a spot about halfway down the rows, just slightly off-center, perfect view. The movie started, and for a while, it was just like I'd hoped. Quiet, still, just me and the screen. Maybe 20 minutes in, I glanced behind me, just out of habit, and noticed there was a man sitting a few rows back. I didn't remember him coming in, but then again, I hadn't really been paying attention. He was just sitting there, hands folded in his lap, looking at the screen. Nothing weird about that, so I turned back around. The movie went on, but every so often, I got this feeling. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck, like someone's eyes are boring into you? I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just the atmosphere of the film getting to me. But after a few minutes, I turned around again, and he was closer. Just 1 row back from where he'd been. Still staring at the screen, expressionless, as if he hadn't moved at all. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe he'd been there the whole time, and I just misjudged the distance. I went back to the movie, focusing on the actors' voices, the sounds of the scenes. But the feeling didn't go away. A few minutes later, I peeked again. He'd moved forward another row. This time, I was sure. He wasn't just moving seats for a better view. He was shifting, little by little, and he was definitely closer than he had been at the start. My pulse was starting to pick up. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that he probably just wanted to sit somewhere else, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. As the movie went on, I couldn't focus. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, trying to be subtle about it. Each time I looked, he was a little closer. First, he was 2 rows back. Then he was just 1 row behind me. By then, I was gripping the arms of my seat, barely even watching the screen. The worst part was that every time I looked back, he was just sitting there, staring straight at the screen like he hadn't even noticed me. Not once did he look at me, not even a flicker of his eyes in my direction. It was almost like he was pretending I wasn't there, or like he was playing some game only he understood. It made my skin crawl. Finally, I couldn't take it. I decided I'd leave. The movie wasn't worth this, no film was. But when I started to stand up, I heard a voice, quiet and low, barely above a whisper. "He's going to do it now," the voice said. I froze. I didn't look back, didn't even turn my head, but I knew it was him. I knew he was the one speaking, and he was whispering in sync with the movie. I could hear the actor on screen saying the exact same line, but this man behind me was whispering it right along with him, word for word, in this low, eerie tone that felt like it was crawling into my ears. I sat back down, trying to ignore it, hoping he'd stop. Maybe he was just one of those people who liked quoting lines. Maybe he was some kind of superfan who'd seen the movie a dozen times. I told myself anything to make it feel normal, but deep down, I knew none of it was right. Then, after another minute, he spoke again, just as quietly. "She thinks she's safe." My hand started shaking. The line was from the movie, but he said it with this edge, like he knew I was listening, like he was saying it to me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept my eyes fixed on the screen, trying to pretend I couldn't hear him, that I didn't know he was there. He kept going. Every few minutes, he'd whisper something. Every time, it was right along with the movie, like he had the entire script memorized. The worst part was how calm he sounded, how smooth his voice was, like he was barely trying, just murmuring to himself. And each time he spoke, he sounded closer, like he was leaning forward, inch by inch. Then he said, "Run." It wasn't part of the movie. I knew that line wasn't in the script. I'd seen the trailer enough to know. But he said it anyway, so quietly I almost missed it, like it was meant just for me. And that's when I finally looked. He was right beside me. He hadn't just moved rows. He'd crept along the aisle, moving from seat to seat, until he was sitting there, right next to me, so close I could feel the warmth of his arm against mine. His face was still pointed at the screen, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth barely moving as he murmured the next line in sync with the actor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in my seat, every muscle locked up with fear. He was right there, so close I could smell the faint scent of stale smoke on his clothes, could hear the quiet rasp of his breath. Then he turned his head, so slowly it made my stomach twist. He didn't look at me, not directly, but his eyes slid to the side, just enough that I could see the edge of his gaze. "I know what happens next," he whispered. I bolted. I didn't even look back to see his reaction. I just tore out of my seat and ran up the aisle, stumbling over my own feet, practically falling through the theater door. I didn't care about the stares I got from the few people in the lobby. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, hands shaking so bad I could barely pull my car keys out of my pocket. I jumped in my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot, not even caring where I was headed. I just wanted to get as far from that theater as I could, as fast as I could. It wasn't until I'd driven halfway across town that I finally pulled over, parked on some quiet street, and tried to catch my breath. I never went back to that theater. I don't know what his deal was, if he was just trying to mess with me, or if he was actually dangerous. But I can still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, that low, steady whisper. I was working on a photography project, places of worship around the city, mostly older buildings with that heavy, almost eerie history to them. I liked the silence, the emptiness. There's a strange calm to those places at night when they're supposed to be empty. I'd managed to get permission to photograph this old church that had been closed down for years. It was in rough shape, dust thick on everything, the smell of damp settling in every corner. Perfect for what I wanted. I got there around midnight, set up my tripod near the altar, and started shooting. The only sounds were the faint clicks of my camera and the occasional creak of wood settling. The place was dark except for the dim light filtering in from a street lamp outside and the small flashlight I had with me. It was cold too, my breath came out in visible puffs. After about an hour of shooting, I started noticing faint noises. It wasn't much at first. Just a light tap here, a shuffle there, like an animal scurrying around in the dark corners. I told myself it was probably a rat or some bird trapped inside. The building had a few broken windows, so it wasn't unlikely. I kept working, but the sound didn't stop. It got louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from somewhere toward the back of the church. I froze, hoping maybe it was just the building shifting or something. But the steps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. It sounded like slow, careful pacing, like they were waiting for something. I was alone. I'd locked the door when I came in, so I didn't understand how anyone else could be there. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and turned around. My flashlight beam swung through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just empty pews and shadows, stretching all the way to the back wall. I tried to calm myself down, but the footsteps picked up again, closer this time, and more insistent. They stopped a few feet behind me, and that's when I heard someone clear their throat. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to turn around, expecting. I don't know what, but definitely not what I saw. A man stood there, dressed in old, faded clothes that looked like they belonged in another decade. His face was blank, just staring at me. The thing that struck me the most was how still he was. He didn't move, didn't even blink. He was just standing there, watching. "Can I help you?" I managed to ask, my voice a lot shakier than I would have liked. "I'm the caretaker here," he said, in this flat, almost rehearsed tone. "You're here late. You shouldn't be." There was something strange in his voice, like he was forcing himself to sound normal but didn't quite know how. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on me with this intense focus that made my skin crawl. "I'm a photographer," I said, trying to sound calm. "I got permission to shoot here." The man didn't react. He just kept staring at me, his eyes unblinking. "They didn't tell me about that," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't be here. Not at this hour." I tried to reason with him, saying I had the paperwork and everything, but he didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he took a slow step forward. It wasn't much, just a tiny shift, but it was enough to make my heart race. Who gave you permission?" he asked, his voice so quiet I barely heard it. I was starting to feel uneasy. Something about this man wasn't right. He was too calm, too still. I told him the name of the person who'd arranged the access, hoping it would satisfy him, but he didn't even blink. "They didn't tell me," he repeated, his voice a bit louder now, like he was talking more to himself than to me. The whole situation felt off. I glanced at my gear, wondering if I should just pack up and go. I didn't want to make this guy mad, but there was something unsettling about him. Something that made me want to get out of there as fast as possible. The man stepped closer again, his face still blank, eyes never leaving me. "It's not safe here," he murmured, almost like a warning. "Not for you." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just finish up and leave, okay?" He shook his head slowly, that strange, empty expression never changing. "You won't leave," he said, almost to himself. "Not yet." Something in his tone chilled me to the bone. He sounded so sure, like he knew something I didn't, something he wasn't telling me. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I started to pack up my camera, keeping one eye on him. The whole time, he just stood there, watching, his face a blank mask. When I was done, I grabbed my bag and turned to head toward the door. But he moved to block my path, quick and silent, like he'd been waiting for that moment. His face was close to mine now, close enough that I could see the dark shadows under his eyes, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You're not leaving," he said, and this time there was a hint of something in his voice, almost excitement. I took a step back, feeling the panic start to build. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from him. "Listen, man," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll just head out. No need for this." He smiled then, this slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're here," he said, like it explained everything, like that was all he needed to keep me there. I tried to sidestep him, but he moved with me, blocking my way again. My pulse was racing now, my hands starting to sweat. I could feel that sense of dread growing, the realization that I might not get out of there as easily as I thought. "Why won't you let me leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his expression changed. There was something dark in his gaze, something that made my stomach twist. "It's not your time," he murmured, almost as if he was talking to himself. Then he turned, walked a few steps back into the darkness, and disappeared. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. The second he was out of sight, I bolted for the door, practically running down the aisle and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the keys into the ignition. When I finally looked back at the church, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. His expression was calm, almost amused, like he'd expected me to run. He didn't move, didn't try to follow me, but I could feel his eyes on me even as I drove away. I don't know what he wanted or why he was there. All I know is that I won't be going back to that church again. Whatever was wrong with him, whatever his reason for keeping me there, it was something I don't ever want to understand. I was on the trail alone that day, planning on a quiet hike through some of my favorite spots. It wasn't too far from home, a place I'd gone 100 times before, so I felt safe there. I parked my car, grabbed my backpack, and headed up the trail, just wanting a bit of peace. There weren't many people around since it was late afternoon on a weekday. That's one of the reasons I liked it. I usually only passed a handful of people, most of them minding their own business. I was a few miles in when I saw him. He was coming down the path in the opposite direction, moving at a relaxed pace. I noticed him looking my way before he even reached me, but I didn't think much of it. As he got closer, though, he smiled, a little too wide, a little too eager. I remember thinking he was being overly friendly for a stranger, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I just nodded and kept walking. He stopped in front of me and said, "Hey there, nice day for a hike, right?" I agreed, not really wanting to get into a conversation. I tried to keep walking, but he stepped to the side, blocking my way, and said, "Mind if I join you for a bit? You know, it's safer to hike with someone." That was strange. I had never heard anyone say that around here. It wasn't like we were out in the wilderness. It was just a local hiking trail, and plenty of people walked it alone. I told him I preferred to hike by myself, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. But he didn't seem to care. He laughed, saying, "Oh, come on. I'm just being friendly. It's a nice day, and two's better than one, right?" Something about the way he said it made me feel uneasy. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but there was a look in his eyes that didn't match his smile. I wanted to walk away, but he was still standing in front of me, blocking the path. I felt like my options were limited. Finally, I decided it'd be less trouble to just let him tag along for a while. I figured he'd get bored or head off on his own after a bit. So I nodded and started walking again, hoping he'd keep a respectful distance. He didn't. Instead, he kept pace right next to me, close enough that I could feel his shoulder brush against mine every now and then. I kept glancing over, and he was always looking at me, watching. We walked in silence for a few minutes, and then he started asking questions. "Do you come here often? How far are you planning to go?" I tried to keep my answers short, hoping he'd take the hint. But he kept pressing, asking about my job, my family, even what kind of car I drove. I remember thinking, why would he care about that? At one point, he casually mentioned that he knew I liked hiking because he'd seen it online. That's when I really started to feel uneasy. I hadn't shared much about hiking on social media, just a couple of photos here and there, but I never posted where I went or when. I asked him what he meant by that, and he just laughed, shrugging it off like it was nothing. "Oh, I just meant you seem like an outdoorsy type." It's obvious, right? But the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I started to wonder if he'd been looking at my profiles or something. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his name, where he was from, or anything about him. And yet, he acted like we were close friends. After that, I tried to pick up my pace, hoping he'd fall behind, but he kept up effortlessly. I was starting to get frustrated, feeling trapped. Then he started talking about things that I'd posted on my account, things that I knew I'd only shared with friends. He mentioned my dog by name, talked about a trip I'd taken last year, things that a random stranger would have no way of knowing. I stopped in my tracks, finally looking him straight in the eye. "How do you know all this about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just smiled, that too friendly smile, and shrugged again. "It's a small world," he said, like that explained everything. But his eyes, they weren't friendly. There was something dark there, something that made my skin crawl. I told him I needed to head back to my car, hoping he'd get the message and leave. But he just kept following me, not even pretending to give me any space now. Every time I tried to slow down or speed up, he'd adjust his pace, sticking to me like a shadow. The worst part was, we were a few miles away from the parking lot. It was quiet out there, no one else around, just trees and silence. I realized that if he decided to do something, no one would hear me. I kept my face forward, not wanting him to see how scared I was. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have a weapon, nothing to defend myself with if he tried anything. All I could do was keep walking and hope he'd get bored and leave me alone. Then, he started talking again. This time, he wasn't asking questions. He was making comments about my appearance, about the way I walked, even about the clothes I was wearing. His tone was different now, less friendly and more. I don't know how to describe it. It was like he was sizing me up, making me feel small and exposed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped again, turning to face him. "Look, I don't know what you want, but you need to leave me alone." He stared at me, and for a second, I thought he'd listen. But then he took a step closer, so close that I could feel his breath on my face. "I just want to get to know you better," he whispered, his voice low and too familiar. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." That's when I knew he'd been following me, watching me for who knows how long. Maybe online, maybe in person. I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get away. Without thinking, I turned and started running, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't care if he was following. All I could think about was getting to my car, getting somewhere safe. The trail was rough, and I stumbled a few times, but I didn't stop. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, and I knew he was still there, still coming after me. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my lungs aching. When I finally reached the parking lot, I saw my car up ahead, and I fumbled for my keys, praying I wouldn't drop them. I heard him behind me, closer now, his footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I didn't dare look back. I just kept going, focused on unlocking the door and getting inside. The second I got in, I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. I looked up, and he was there, standing just a few feet away, watching me through the window. His expression was calm, almost amused, like this was all a game to him. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I started the car and peeled out of the lot, my hands shaking on the wheel. In my rearview mirror, I saw him still standing there, watching as I drove away. I don't know who he was, how long he'd been watching me, or what he wanted. All I know is that I've never been back to that trail, and I never will. I deleted all my social media after that, changed my routines, everything. I was working late one night in the campus library. I had a paper due the next morning, and I was in no shape to finish it in my dorm room where my roommate would have the TV on or be playing video games. The library was one of the only places I could really focus, and usually, by midnight, it was practically empty. I had my laptop out, headphones on, head buried in my notes, trying to push through the last few pages of my essay. It was cold, and the place was quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional creak from the old building. I remember that I barely even noticed the guy at first. I glanced up once or twice, and he was just sitting there, a few tables away. Maybe he was working on his own paper or whatever, but I didn't think much of it. About an hour went by. I got up to stretch my legs and grab a coffee from the vending machine around the corner. When I came back, I noticed there was something on my table. Just a little crumpled up piece of paper, like trash someone had left behind. I thought it was weird, but I brushed it off. I figured maybe it had been stuck to my backpack or something, so I ignored it and got back to work. After a few more minutes, I started to feel this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just because the library was so empty and quiet. But then I looked up, and I noticed that guy again, sitting there, but this time he was looking right at me. Not just glancing up occasionally, but actually staring. I looked away quickly, hoping he'd take the hint. I put my head down, focused on my laptop screen, and tried to push the uncomfortable feeling out of my mind. But a few minutes later, I saw him move out of the corner of my eye. He stood up, and I thought maybe he was leaving. I felt relieved. But instead, he walked over to my table, dropped something, and walked back to his seat without saying a word. It was another crumpled piece of paper. This time, I picked it up. I was annoyed, maybe even a little freaked out, and I wanted to see what this guy's deal was. I smoothed it out, expecting it to be some kind of dumb joke or maybe even trash. But the words written on it were strange. You have the 8 a.m. class in Galloway Hall. I froze for a second, reading it over again. I definitely didn't know this guy, and I hadn't told anyone my schedule. I looked back over to his table, and he was just sitting there, staring at me with this blank expression. Not a smile, not even a frown, just blank, like he was studying me. It gave me the creeps. I didn't want him to see that he was getting to me, so I just crumpled the note up and threw it in my bag, trying to act like it was nothing. I went back to typing, glancing up every so often, but he hadn't moved. He just kept staring, like he was waiting for something. After a while, he got up again, and I felt myself tense up. He walked past my table and, once again, dropped another crumpled piece of paper. I was seriously getting annoyed now, but something in me had to know what it said. So, I picked it up, opened it slowly, and read the next note. You like to sit by the window in the dining hall. This one hit a little too close to home. I did sit by the window in the dining hall almost every day. It wasn't exactly a huge secret, but still, it felt wrong. It wasn't just a random fact someone would know unless they'd been watching. My stomach started twisting. I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy knew way too much about me, and he was enjoying how uncomfortable I looked. I stared at him, hoping he'd look away, maybe get the message and leave. But he didn't. He just kept looking right back at me, as if he was daring me to say something. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I didn't even know what to say. Stop leaving me creepy notes didn't feel strong enough for whatever was happening here. Another few minutes passed, and I was pretending to work, not even looking at my screen anymore. Then, he got up again, and I felt a chill go through me. I didn't want him to come any closer, didn't want him to leave another note, but he did. He dropped it right next to me, and this time, I almost didn't pick it up. But I had to know. This one read, "Your dorm room faces the quad." My blood ran cold. He knew where I lived. Not just what building or floor, he knew the exact room. I couldn't even imagine how. I looked up at him, and he had this tiny smile on his face, like he knew he'd gotten to me. I felt trapped, pinned down by his gaze. I wanted to run, to leave the library and get as far away from this guy as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I finally managed to whisper, "What do you want?" My voice was shaky, and I could barely get the words out. I didn't even know if he heard me, but then he got up again, slowly, like he had all the time in the world, and he started walking over. I thought about running, about grabbing my stuff and bolting out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. He leaned down, putting his hands on the table, way too close to me, and whispered, "I just wanted to say hello. After all, we're neighbors." I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't even want to know. He was close enough that I could see every line on his face, smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. Then he straightened up, took a few steps back, and just watched me again. I felt my skin crawl. Before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one more note. He didn't drop it this time. He handed it to me directly, forcing me to take it from his hand. I unfolded it, my hand shaking, and read the words. "I'll be watching." That was it. No more, no less. Just those 3 words. It felt like a threat, a promise, something I couldn't escape. I don't even remember packing up my things or leaving the library. I just remember the feeling of his eyes on me as I walked out, as if he was burning holes into my back. I practically sprinted back to my dorm, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't look over my shoulder, didn't dare check if he was following me. I just locked myself in my room and sat there, staring at the door, listening for any sound outside. I never saw him in the library again after that, but for weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I used to do my laundry at the 24-hour laundromat a couple blocks from my apartment. It was old, small, and pretty run down, but it was the only place close by that didn't charge a fortune. I always went late at night since I didn't like the crowds, and honestly, I thought it would be safer. I didn't expect anyone to be around at that hour, maybe just the occasional person passing through. That night was quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of the machines and the clinking of coins as I loaded them in. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting this dim, cold light across the whole place. I kept my head down, folding clothes while I waited for the dryer to finish. I didn't pay much attention to anything around me at first. Then I noticed him. I glanced up, and there he was, standing outside, just beyond the glass doors. He was just staring right through the glass, watching me like he was studying something. His eyes didn't move, his gaze was fixed straight on me, not looking at anything else. It was unsettling, but I tried to tell myself he was just waiting for someone or maybe taking a break if he worked nearby. I tried to ignore it. I went back to folding, keeping my head down, focusing on the shirts in front of me. But I could feel him watching. Every time I looked up, he hadn't moved. He was still there, just standing, with this strange blank look on his face. I tried to brush it off. Told myself it was nothing. A few minutes went by, and I thought he might have left, but then I looked up, and he was gone. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I was just making a big deal out of nothing. I let myself relax, focusing on the warmth coming from the dryer as I took out my clothes. But then, just as I was about to finish, I heard the sound of the door creaking open. I looked up, and there he was, stepping inside the laundromat. He didn't say anything. He just stood near the door, looking around, almost like he was pretending to be interested in the machines. He didn't have any laundry with him, didn't look like he was here for that at all. I kept my head down, telling myself to just ignore him, that he'd leave once he saw I wasn't paying attention. But he started walking over, slow, taking these soft steps that barely made any noise. My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normal, pretending I was focused on my laundry. Then he stopped, just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could feel his presence. "You here alone?" he asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd get the hint. But he didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, his eyes fixed on me like he could see right through me. I finally forced myself to look up, trying to keep my voice steady as I replied, "I'm just finishing up." He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer, still staring. He looked so calm, almost like he was waiting for something, some signal to move. I felt this deep sense of unease settle in, like I needed to get out of there right then. I glanced at the clock, hoping it would be a decent time to call someone, but it was past midnight. No one would be awake. "You come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, like we were just two people chatting. I forced a nod, keeping my eyes on my laundry, folding each piece as quickly as I could. He moved closer again, stepping right into my space. I felt trapped, cornered between him and the row of washers. I could feel his eyes on me, every move I made, like he was studying me, waiting for a reaction. He didn't say anything after that. Just kept standing there, so close I could smell his stale breath, the faint smell of smoke clinging to him. I was just focused on my hands, trying to stay calm, telling myself he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't. "You know, I forgot something here last time," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thought I'd come back and look for it." I just nodded again, not wanting to engage. I was scared. The way he was looking at me felt wrong, like he was enjoying how uncomfortable I was. I started to edge toward my laundry bag, hoping he wouldn't notice, that I could just grab my stuff and leave. But he noticed. He moved his arm, blocking my way, forcing me to look up at him. His eyes were dark, empty, almost like there was nothing behind them. "You in a hurry?" he asked, a slight smile forming on his face. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I've got to go." He just stood there, that creepy smile not moving. I started to feel my pulse quicken, the air around me suddenly feeling thick, like it was hard to breathe. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I just needed to get past him, get to the door. I didn't care about leaving the laundry behind. I took a step back, and he took a step forward. My heart was pounding so loud, I could barely hear anything else. I felt my throat tighten. I took another step back, and he mirrored me, each of us moving in this strange, silent dance, like he was taunting me. Finally, I managed to break away, moving around him, keeping my eyes on the door. But just as I was about to reach it, he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, almost painful. I looked up at him, my stomach twisting. "You're leaving already?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to pull my arm free, but he held on. His hand was cold, and his grip was firm. I could feel the panic rising in me, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. "I've got to go," I said, barely managing to get the words out. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't let go. He just looked at me, that same empty stare, like he was trying to decide something. I thought about screaming, but I didn't know if anyone would hear me. The laundromat was isolated, with no one around at this time of night. Then, finally, he released me. I stumbled back, grabbing my things as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them. I didn't look back, didn't say anything else. I just bolted for the door, my heart racing as I stepped out into the cold night air. As I walked home, I felt his eyes on me, even though I didn't look back to check if he was watching. I just kept walking, my mind replaying everything that had just happened, my stomach twisting with fear. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment, locking the door behind me, my hands still trembling. After that night, I couldn't go back to that laundromat. I started going to one across town, no matter how inconvenient it was. I didn't care. I never wanted to see that man again, never wanted to feel that kind of fear. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching me. I had been working a stressful job for the last few months, so when I finally got a weekend off, I decided to get away for a bit. I booked a small, remote cabin in the woods, about 2 hours away from the city. The kind of place where there's no phone service, no internet, just peace and quiet. Perfect for getting my head straight. I got there late on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting, and I could already feel the tension from work start to melt away. The cabin was rustic, a little older than I expected, but it was cozy. It had one of those old wood-burning stoves and a fireplace that crackled when I lit it. There was no one else around for miles, and I made a point not to mention this trip to anyone, not even on social media. I didn't want anyone to know where I was. I was just there to relax and clear my mind. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fire. I didn't have any plans for the weekend, just wanted to enjoy the silence. I spent the night watching a movie on my laptop, the kind of thing you do when you're alone in a cabin, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was dark, but the moonlight outside provided enough light for me to make my way to the bedroom. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the stove to make sure it was off, and got into bed. The sheets were soft, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually get some sleep. I don't know exactly when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, maybe around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but there was a feeling in the air. Something wasn't right. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence of the cabin. For a moment, I thought maybe I had just been imagining things, but then I heard a faint sound. A soft shuffling noise, like something scraping against the wood floor. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. The house was completely still. No animals, no wind. It was dead quiet. But then I heard it again, the sound of something moving just outside my door. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal outside, but then the sound came again, this time, much closer, like something was right outside my door. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. Then came a faint tap on the door. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one knew I was here. The tap was soft, almost like someone was trying to be quiet, but I could still hear it clearly. I wasn't sure if I should check or not. Part of me thought I should just ignore it, that maybe I was just hearing things. But the other part of me, the part that was suddenly scared, wanted to know who it was. I got out of bed slowly, making sure not to make any noise. My feet hit the cold wood of the floor as I tiptoed toward the door. I didn't dare open it, but I stood close to the edge, trying to listen. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and I held my breath. For what felt like forever, there was no sound. Then, out of nowhere, there was a soft slide under the door. I jumped back, almost falling over. My heart was racing now. Something had been slipped under the door. I didn't know what it was, but the thought of someone being out there, so close, sent a chill through me. I felt trapped, like I couldn't get away from whatever it was. I walked carefully to the door, my legs weak with nerves. I didn't want to open it, but I had to know. I bent down slowly, reaching for the paper that had been left there. When I looked at it, my stomach dropped. The letter was handwritten in neat, careful handwriting. It said, "I saw you take a walk this afternoon." The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I wonder what you did out there. My head spun. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anything. The idea that someone was out there, watching me, made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, the letter in my hand, trying to think. It didn't make sense. How could someone know where I'd been? I had stayed on the path all day, far away from the cabin. I hadn't seen a soul. I hadn't even thought to lock the door when I went out. But there was no way someone had followed me that day, right? I started to panic. I looked around the room like I might spot something, someone, but there was nothing. Just a normal, empty cabin. I couldn't even bring myself to check outside. What if someone was watching me now? I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and tried to go back to bed, but sleep was impossible. The feeling of being watched kept me awake, the letter burning in my mind. I kept imagining someone out there in the woods, hiding, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I spent most of the time inside the cabin, looking out the windows, paranoid. I didn't go outside much. I didn't want to risk being seen. The whole day felt off, like something was lingering in the air. It wasn't until I finally decided to leave that I realized the door had been unlocked. The handle had been moved, just enough for me to see it had been tampered with. But I was sure I'd locked it before I went out. That night, I didn't know what to expect. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to stay in the cabin. I waited for hours, my mind racing, and then, just as the night before, there was another tap on the door. Quiet. Deliberate. I didn't even bother checking the door this time. I just grabbed my things, and without a second thought, I ran. I didn't even know where I was going at first, but I just needed to get away. I didn't care if it was dark or if I had no plan. I had to leave the cabin. As I walked through the woods, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. I don't know why I didn't call the police. Maybe I was just too scared, or maybe it didn't feel real. But the farther I got from the cabin, the more I felt like I was finally free. When I finally reached the nearest road and found a car to get me back into town, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't go back for my things, and I didn't think I ever would. I'm not sure who was watching me, or why they were doing it. But after that night, I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. I was working late again, finishing up some last-minute paperwork that needed to be filed by morning. I wasn't usually the last one in the office, but that night, it felt like everyone else had cleared out hours ago. When I finally got everything wrapped up, it was well after midnight. The building was quiet, and the hum of the lights in the hallways was the only sound as I made my way down to the parking garage. It was the same way it always was, silent, dimly lit, the type of place where the sound of your own footsteps feels loud and makes you glance over your shoulder. I'd parked on the second level that day, closer to the elevators, since I was planning on leaving late. Most people don't like parking there, because the lights flicker, and the whole level has a musty smell. But I thought it would feel safer, being nearer to the elevator. I wasn't so sure anymore. I stepped out into the lot, and that uneasy feeling washed over me as soon as I rounded the corner and saw the emptiness stretching out, just rows of cars in a dim space with concrete pillars casting long shadows. I shook it off and focused on getting to my car, not really expecting anything. But as I got closer, I noticed someone standing a little ways off, near the wall by the stairwell. A man, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, leaning against a pillar like he was waiting for someone. I immediately felt uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him, hoping he wouldn't notice me, but as soon as I was close enough, he straightened up and started walking toward me. I felt my heart speed up, and I gripped my keys tighter, moving a little faster. I could hear his footsteps, though he was coming closer, and it didn't seem like he was going to walk past me. Right when I got to my car, I heard his voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss?" I turned slightly, just enough to see him over my shoulder, not wanting to fully face him. He stopped a few feet away, looking uncomfortable, but in a way that seemed a little forced, like he was pretending to be harmless. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't seem to find my car." I tried to be polite, even though every instinct was telling me to just ignore him. "I haven't seen any other cars down here tonight," I replied. "Maybe it's on a different level?" He gave a small, nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm pretty sure it was here. I parked in a hurry, so I could have sworn it was around here somewhere." He glanced around, then back at me, and his smile faded a bit. "Do you think you could give me a ride to the exit? I just need to get to the street and call for help." I swallowed hard, trying not to let the panic show on my face. "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I can't help you." I turned back to my car, pulling the door open as quickly as I could. But before I could get inside, he took a step closer. "Please," he said, his voice more insistent this time. "I just need to get out of here. My phone died, and it's freezing out here. It won't take long." I kept my back to him, hoping he'd take the hint. "I'm sorry, I have to go." I tried to get into the car, but his hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the door before I could close it. His grip was strong, his knuckles white, and for a moment, I froze, my mind racing, trying to think of what to do. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other option," he said, his voice calm, too calm, like he was used to people saying no, and he'd learned how to push just the right way. "I just need a ride down to the entrance. You can drop me off right there. It's not safe for me to walk down alone." I kept my eyes down, but I could feel his gaze on me, that same calmness in his voice turning into something sharper, more intense. He wasn't asking anymore, he was telling. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew I couldn't let him in the car, I took a deep breath and forced myself to look up at him, meeting his eyes with as much confidence as I could muster. "Let go of my door," I said, my voice steady but firm. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face blank, and I thought he might try to force his way in. But then, slowly, he let go, his hand falling back to his side. He didn't step back, though. He just stood there, staring at me with a look that made my skin crawl. "Fine," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I get it." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. I didn't even check my mirrors as I backed out, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. But as I pulled out of the spot, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing there, watching me, his expression dark, unreadable. I drove out of the garage as fast as I could, my heart racing, my hands shaking on the wheel. I felt a surge of relief as soon as I was out in the open, under the streetlights, away from that empty concrete space that had felt so suffocating. I didn't go back to work the next day. I called my boss and told her what happened. She didn't say much, just told me to take the day off and rest. I could tell she didn't really believe me, thought I was just overreacting or something. But I knew what I'd felt, that cold, creeping fear that had settled into my bones, that feeling that something wasn't right, that he'd been waiting there, just for me. The days passed, and I tried to forget, to push it out of my mind. But every time I thought about it, I could still see his face, that blank, empty look, and hear his voice, that calm, insistent tone that had made my skin crawl. I started parking closer to the building, under the lights, where I could see anyone who might be waiting. I made sure to leave work before it got too late, to never be the last one in the office. And every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, watching, waiting. I stopped at this old roadside rest stop around 1 in the morning. I'd been driving for hours and hadn't seen a single other car on the road. The rest stop looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, but I was tired, and I needed to use the bathroom. There were a few flickering lights in the parking lot, barely enough to see by, and it was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the bulbs. I got out of the car and made my way over, the door creaking as I opened it. The bathroom was small, with 2 stalls and a sink that looked like it barely worked. It smelled stale and damp, like it had been left to rot. I was just about to push open one of the stall doors when I heard the entrance door creak behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man standing there, just inside the doorway. I didn't think too much of it at first, figured he was just another traveler. I nodded politely, then stepped into the stall and locked the door behind me. As I started to do my business, I heard his footsteps move closer, slow and deliberate, almost like he was dragging each foot forward. I suddenly felt tense, aware of each tiny noise in the restroom, even my own breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside my stall. I held my breath, trying not to make any sound. I didn't know what his problem was, and I didn't want to find out. Then I heard him mutter something. I couldn't catch what he was saying, but his voice was low, like he was talking to himself or to me. "Hey," he whispered. "You think I don't know who you are?" I stayed silent, hoping he'd go away if I didn't respond. I kept telling myself he was just some weirdo, maybe drunk or high, probably just talking to himself. But then he spoke again, louder, his voice dropping to a growl. "I know you're in there. You can't hide." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I was trapped, with nowhere to go. There was no one else around, no one to hear me if I yelled. I thought about standing up, maybe trying to scare him off, but my hands were shaking, and I wasn't sure what he'd do if I made a move. I could hear him pacing just outside the stall, his footsteps shuffling back and forth. Then he stopped again, leaning close to the door. I could see his shadow under the stall door, right up against it, like he was pressing his face against the gap. "Why don't you come out?" he whispered, the edge in his voice growing sharper. "Or are you afraid?" I bit down hard, not letting myself make a sound. I could feel sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I didn't know if he was armed, if he was just messing with me, or if he was planning something worse. My heart was pounding so loud I was afraid he could hear it. Suddenly, I heard him laugh, a short, humorless sound that made my stomach twist. "I know what you did. Don't think you can run from it." I had no idea what he was talking about. I wanted to tell him he had the wrong person, that I didn't know him, but my throat felt tight, like the words were stuck. I was sure if I made a sound, he'd do something. I could feel the tension building, like he was daring me to speak up, to give him an excuse. The silence dragged on, broken only by the sound of his breathing, rough and uneven. Then, out of nowhere, he slammed his fist against the stall door, rattling it so hard I thought the lock might break. I jumped, barely stopping myself from yelping. "Come out," he hissed. "Or I'll make you come out." My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal in the middle of nowhere, and I knew yelling probably wouldn't bring anyone. I was on my own. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I stayed as still as possible, hoping he'd give up and leave. But he just kept standing there, his shadow looming under the stall door, blocking the light. I could hear him breathing, this angry, ragged sound like he was barely holding back. Then he started whispering again, low and dark. "You're going to pay for it. You know that, right? You thought you could get away, but I'm here now. I'm here." I closed my eyes, trying to shut him out, to pretend I wasn't there, that he'd get bored or distracted and leave. But he wasn't going anywhere. I could feel him leaning closer, pressing against the door, testing the lock. Just when I thought he might actually try to break it open, I heard something. A faint sound, like the creak of the door to the restroom opening. The man's breathing stopped, and I heard him straighten up, turning away from the stall. There was a pause, a moment of silence, and then the footsteps began again, fading slowly toward the door. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, until I was sure he was gone, and then I counted to 10, holding my breath, forcing myself to stay calm. When I finally opened the stall door, the restroom was empty, silent as before. I didn't see him anywhere. I didn't waste any time. I bolted out of there, running back to my car, half expecting him to be standing outside, waiting for me. But the lot was empty. I locked the doors as soon as I got inside and peeled out of there, not looking back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the road, back in a well-lit area with other cars around. Even then, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face staring back at me. It was like I could still hear his voice, whispering in my ear, that same, chilling tone that made my skin crawl. I don't know who he was, or what he wanted, but I'm sure glad I didn't find out. It was just past midnight, and I'd been driving for hours, pushing through the dark stretches of highway with only my headlights lighting the way. I'd seen barely any other cars for miles. It felt like I was alone out there, just me and the road. I was getting tired, so I decided to stop at a rest area I saw coming up on a sign. There was a certain stillness to it, like the place had been abandoned a long time ago, but I told myself it was fine, that I'd be quick. I pulled in, and there wasn't another car in the lot, except for one parked near the far end. It looked old and beat up, something that hadn't been moved in a while. The door was wide open, hanging there in the silence. I figured maybe someone had left it open by mistake, though it seemed odd. I got out of my car and looked around. The place was dead quiet, nothing but the hum of bugs and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I could feel the chill creeping up on me, like something wasn't right, but I tried to shake it off. I started to walk toward the bathrooms, just planning to go in and get back on the road. As I walked past the open car, I felt something pull me to look inside. The seats were covered in dirt, and the dashboard was smeared with dust, like nobody had touched it in months. There was this faint smell too, like stale air mixed with something else I couldn't place. It made my stomach turn a little, but I looked away and kept walking. I was halfway to the building when I heard something, footsteps. I turned, and there was a man standing next to the open car door, watching me. He must have come out of nowhere, because I hadn't seen him when I first looked in that direction. He was tall, skinny, with scruffy hair and a coat that looked 2 sizes too big for him. His face was pale, and he had this strange, blank look in his eyes, like he was barely there. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at me. I felt my throat tighten, every part of me screaming to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I managed to stammer out a quiet, "Hello," hoping he'd just ignore me or maybe explain what he was doing. He tilted his head a little, like he was thinking something over. Then he smiled, this slow, uncomfortable smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was waiting," he said, his voice low and almost too calm. My heart was pounding, and I took a small step back, glancing toward my car. "Waiting for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes followed mine to my car, and he took a step closer, his hand resting on the open door of the beat-up car. "Waiting for someone just like you to come along." His voice was steady, but there was something in it that chilled me to the bone. The way he said "just like you" made it feel like he'd been expecting me, specifically me, even though that didn't make any sense. I took another step back. I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep calm, even though I could feel the panic rising. The man just kept looking at me, that smile still plastered on his face. "You're the one, all right," he murmured. "I knew you'd be here tonight. They always come by eventually." It felt like my skin was crawling, every nerve in my body telling me to turn and run, but I couldn't stop staring at him. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but I need to go." He tilted his head again, like he was considering something. "You think you can just drive away?" he asked, his tone almost playful. "But you stopped. You chose to stop here. Doesn't that mean something to you?" I shook my head, stepping back further, but he moved with me, closing the distance. I could feel the handle of my car behind me, my fingers curling around it, trying to stay calm. "Please, leave me alone," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted. The man took one more step, close enough now that I could see the lines on his face, the way his eyes seemed to sink into his skull. "Oh, but I can't leave you alone." "Not now. You're here." I yanked the car door open, but he reached out, his hand landing on the edge of the door, stopping me from closing it. "Where are you going to go?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Out there in the dark. You don't know what's waiting for you out there." I could barely breathe, his face inches from mine. My hand was shaking as I tried to pull the door shut, but he was stronger than he looked, his grip iron tight. "Please," I managed to say, barely holding back tears. The man leaned in closer, his voice soft but cold. "You know you're not getting away from this, right? You're here for a reason." I finally found the strength to push back, using every ounce of force I had. He stumbled back just enough for me to slam the door shut, and I locked it instantly, my hands fumbling as I scrambled to start the car. I didn't look at him again, didn't dare make eye contact, just kept my eyes on the steering wheel as I fumbled with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I glanced up, and he was standing there, right in front of my car, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I threw the car into reverse, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I backed up and turned, the tires screeching as I sped out of the rest area. In the rearview mirror, I could still see him standing there, watching me, his figure growing smaller as I got farther and farther away. Even after I'd been driving for miles, I kept checking, half expecting to see him following me down the empty road. I didn't stop again that night. I didn't stop for hours, just kept driving, my hands shaking the whole time. Every time I thought of his face, that awful smile, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I don't know who he was, or what he wanted, but I know that if I hadn't left when I did, I might not have made it out of there. I still don't understand what he meant by waiting for someone like me. I don't think I ever want to know. I was passing through this small town, somewhere out in the countryside, just trying to make it to my next destination before midnight. I'd been driving a long time, and my eyes were starting to feel heavy, so when I spotted the lights from an old-looking pub on the side of the road, I figured I'd stop in for a quick drink, maybe something to wake me up a bit. The place looked like it had been there for years, crumbling brick, a wooden sign that swayed with every gust of wind. The windows were fogged up, but there was a glow coming from inside. I could hear faint laughter and the hum of conversation, so it felt safe enough. Just a little, cozy spot tucked out of the way. I pushed the door open, and every sound stopped. It was like someone hit mute on a TV. Every single person in that place turned to look at me. I felt this weird jolt go through me, like I was some animal caught in headlights. But then, one by one, they all started smiling. It wasn't unfriendly, more like they knew me, or thought they did. The bartender, a tall, older guy with gray hair slicked back, waved me over like he'd been expecting me. I wanted to turn around and leave, but it felt rude somehow. So I nodded, a bit stiffly, and walked over to the bar. "Evening, stranger," he said, grinning wide, almost too wide. "We've been waiting for you." "Sorry, I think you might have me mixed up with someone else," I said, trying to laugh it off. "I'm just passing through." The bartender chuckled, shaking his head. "No mistake. You're right on time." It was unsettling, but I figured he was just being friendly, so I ordered a drink. As I waited, I noticed a few people were still looking at me from their tables. They all wore these little smiles, watching me with this strange intensity. I looked down at my glass and took a sip, trying to ignore them, but their eyes never left me. I felt trapped under all that attention. When I nearly finished my drink, I nodded to the bartender and tried to stand, but before I could, a hand landed on my shoulder. I glanced up, and there was this woman, older, maybe in her 50s, with this dark red lipstick that was just a little smudged. "Don't be in such a hurry, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Stay a while." "Yeah," another voice chimed in. I looked over and saw a man a few stools down, smiling at me with these eyes that looked far too excited. "You just got here. No need to leave so soon." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shrugged our hands off, forcing a smile. "I really should get going. I have a long drive ahead." The bartender set another drink in front of me, though I hadn't ordered it. "On the house," he said, giving me that same grin. "Just stay a bit longer. No harm in that, is there?" I looked around the room. Every person was staring at me now. I tried to stand again, but the older woman leaned over and whispered, "We don't get visitors here often. Especially not ones like you." The way she said that last part made my stomach twist. "Ones like me?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly. Ones who fit. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to know. I pulled out a few bills and set them on the bar, keeping my movements slow and calm. Thanks for the drink, but I really have to go. The bartender's smile faded just a little. His eyes narrowed, like he was calculating something. Leaving already? That's a shame. I backed toward the door, every instinct in me screaming that I needed to get out of there. Just as my hand reached the handle, the door swung shut, locking itself. My pulse spiked. What's going on? Just relax, the bartender said, his voice smooth and calm. No need to get worked up. You're safe here. The people around the tables began to stand up, slowly, almost in unison. They didn't say a word, just watched me, like they were waiting for something. I said I have to go, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. A man near the door shook his head, smiling that same awful smile. You can't leave yet. We've been waiting a long time for you. That was when it hit me. They weren't joking. They were serious. Every one of them seemed to think I was meant to be here, like I'd been part of some plan they'd been hatching. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, trapping me in that room. Look, I don't know what this is, but I'm leaving, I said, louder this time. My voice echoed in the quiet. The bartender sighed, almost like he was disappointed. It's not safe out there for someone like you, especially not tonight. The words were chilling, the way he said them. I felt a bead of sweat run down my neck. I'll take my chances. I tried to pull the door open again, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the lock click. I turned and saw the bartender holding a set of keys, twirling them around his finger with that smug look on his face. You're not going anywhere, he said. The people were getting closer now, moving in around me, blocking every possible way out. My mind raced, searching for some excuse, some way to get them to let me go. Please, I just stopped in for a drink. I didn't mean to intrude. Oh, you're not intruding, the older woman said, her voice almost sweet. This is exactly where you're supposed to be. I took a step back, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my ears. Why are you doing this? Like we said, the bartender replied, his smile never wavering. We've been waiting. I could feel the walls closing in, every face watching me with that unblinking stare, as if they'd already made up their minds about something. My pulse was racing, my breathing shallow. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy or rude anymore. I had to get out of there. I turned, pushing through the small crowd, shoving anyone in my way. I didn't care about the looks, the gasps, the disapproving whispers. I just needed to get to that door. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps closing in, but I pushed harder, slamming my shoulder into the door with all the strength I had. Somehow, it gave way, just enough for me to slip out. I stumbled into the night, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were following. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and locked it, jamming the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I finally looked up at the pub. They were all standing there in the doorway, watching me, those same blank, expectant smiles on every face. The bartender raised his hand, giving me this slow, almost friendly wave, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. I hit the gas and tore out of that parking lot, my heart still pounding even as I got back on the highway. I didn't look back. I kept driving, even when the headlights of the pub faded in the distance. Every so often, though, I thought I could see that place out of the corner of my eye, still standing there, waiting. I don't know what they wanted from me, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing, I'll never stop at another small town bar again. I was out late, around 10:30, walking my dog, Daisy. I don't normally go that late, but I had a busy day, and she was getting antsy. I didn't think much of it since our neighborhood is quiet, even at night. I could go a whole block without seeing anyone, maybe a car passing here or there, but that's about it. We'd only gone a few minutes when I noticed a guy across the street, standing on the corner. At first, I thought he was just waiting for someone or taking a smoke break, something like that. He was looking our way, but I tried to ignore it. We were just out for a walk, right? I didn't owe anyone my attention. Daisy was sniffing around, as usual, probably taking her sweet time so she could drag the walk out longer. I let her, figuring we'd just take a loop around the block and head back. But when I looked up again, that guy was still there, just watching us. He hadn't moved an inch. Something about it made me uneasy, so I decided to turn down another street. I kept my eyes on Daisy, not wanting to look back and make it obvious I'd noticed him. We walked a little faster, and I hoped that'd be enough to shake whatever strange feeling I had. But as we reached the next block, I felt this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder. He'd crossed the street. He was on our side now, a few paces behind us, moving at a casual pace, hands in his pockets, like he was out for a late-night stroll. The only problem was, he didn't have a dog with him. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he lived around here, just taking a walk like I was. That's what I wanted to believe, anyway. I tugged Daisy's leash, trying to subtly speed her up without making it obvious I was hurrying. She resisted at first, taking her nose into some patch of grass like it was the most interesting thing she'd ever smelled. My nerves were on edge, and I gave the leash another tug, a bit firmer this time. Finally, she got the hint and started walking. We turned down another block, but I could hear footsteps behind us. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back, quick, like I was just looking around, and there he was. Closer this time. He still had his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on us, unblinking. When he noticed I was looking, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, more like he was amused by something. I felt a chill run through me, and I decided enough was enough. I took out my phone, planning to call someone, anyone, just to have a voice on the other end. But before I could dial, I heard him say, "She's got a lot of energy, doesn't she?" I froze. He was talking about Daisy. The casual tone, like we were acquaintances, made my skin crawl. I looked down at Daisy, who was still sniffing around, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. "Yeah, she does," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want him to know how uncomfortable he was making me. "We're just out for a quick walk." He nodded, but he didn't stop walking, just kept pace with us. "She likes to linger, though, doesn't she?" Always curious about everything. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. Daisy did like to sniff around a lot, but how would he know that? I decided to keep my answer short. "Yep. She's a curious dog." I turned to walk faster, hoping he'd take the hint, but he matched my pace, staying just a step behind. "You know, she's been like that since she was a puppy," he continued, like he was reminiscing about her. That stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him directly, feeling a rush of anger and fear. "How would you know that?" He just shrugged, smiling that same unsettling smile. "I've seen you around. You and Daisy. She's a good dog, always well behaved." I hadn't seen this man before in my life. I was sure of it. And yet he was talking like he knew us, like he'd been watching us for a long time. My mind started racing, trying to figure out if I'd seen him somewhere, maybe in passing, but nothing came up. I decided it was time to go. "Have a good night," I said, forcing a polite smile, and turned to walk away, tugging Daisy along with me. But before I could take a step, he said, "You really shouldn't pull on her leash like that. She doesn't like it." I felt a wave of nausea. Daisy did hate it when I pulled her leash, but there was no way he could know that unless he'd been watching us, studying us. I didn't look back this time. I just started walking, fast, practically dragging Daisy along, hoping to put some distance between us. But then I heard his footsteps again. Faster this time, closing the gap. "Hey, I'm just trying to help," he called out, his voice getting louder, more insistent. I know Daisy pretty well. I could give you some tips if you're having trouble with her. My heart was pounding, and I could feel my hands shaking. I didn't respond, just kept moving, trying to stay calm. Daisy, sensing my anxiety, started pulling forward, which was a relief. She was finally helping me get out of there. But then he spoke again, his voice so close now I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "She doesn't like strangers, does she?" he said, almost in a whisper. That was enough. I broke into a full sprint, practically dragging Daisy with me as I ran toward home. I didn't care if he was following or if he thought I was being rude. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance as I could between me and that man. When I reached my house, I fumbled with the keys, hands trembling as I tried to unlock the door. I could still feel his presence, like he was standing right behind me, just waiting. Finally, the lock clicked, and I shoved the door open, pulling Daisy inside and slamming it shut behind us. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, heart racing as I listened for any sounds outside. I heard nothing, just the quiet of the night, the faint rustle of leaves. I looked out the peephole, but he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I spent the rest of the night double-checking the locks, peering out the windows, convinced he'd show up again. I didn't get a wink of sleep, every little sound making me jump. But he never came back. For days afterward, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I took Daisy out, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the streets for any sign of him. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night stuck with me, the way he spoke about Daisy like he knew her, like he'd been part of our lives all along. Now, I don't take Daisy out at night anymore. And I don't let my guard down, even during the day. It was close to midnight, and I was out on a dark, nearly empty road, heading home after a long day. I'd been driving for hours, and my gas was running low, so I pulled into the only open gas station I'd seen in miles. The place was dead quiet, with just one dim light over the pumps and a small store that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I remember thinking I'd be in and out in a few minutes. Just gas up and get back on the road. I parked by the pump and got out, feeling the cold night air settle over me. I hadn't seen anyone else around, no other cars in sight, so I assumed I was alone. The only sound was the low hum of the lights overhead, flickering every few seconds. I had just started filling the tank when I noticed a figure standing a little ways off, near the corner of the building. He was almost hidden in the shadows, just far enough that I hadn't noticed him at first. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. I tried to ignore it. People can be weird, sure, but not everyone's dangerous. Maybe he was just some guy hanging around, waiting for a ride, or maybe he worked there. I kept telling myself that, but something about the way he was just standing there, so still, had me on edge. I kept my eyes on the pump, counting the seconds, just wanting to get out of there. But then, as the tank was almost full, I saw him start to walk over. I tried not to look directly at him, but he was coming right toward me, so I had no choice. He was tall, probably a few years older than me, wearing an old, worn-out jacket. There was something off in the way he moved, slow but deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "Hey," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "Could you give me a ride?" His voice was low, almost too calm. I remember feeling my stomach drop, and I kept telling myself to stay calm, to keep it casual. I gave him a small shake of my head, trying to sound polite but firm. "Sorry, man, I'm just passing through," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a step closer. "Come on," he said, his voice a little sharper this time. "Just a quick ride. I don't need to go far." I felt my heart start to race. There was no reason for him to be this insistent, not when I'd already said no. I closed the gas cap and tried to act like everything was fine, like I wasn't getting more freaked out by the second. "Sorry, I can't help you," I repeated, this time a little louder, hoping he'd get the hint. I took a step toward my driver's side door, but before I could get there, he moved, blocking my way. He was right in front of my door, close enough that I could see his face under the light. His expression was flat, almost blank, but his eyes, there was something wrong with them. Like he was looking straight through me. "I really need a ride," he said, his tone almost pleading but with a hint of something darker behind it. "I don't think you get it." I swallowed, feeling trapped. I was out there alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around. I kept my hands at my sides, trying to act calm, even though every part of me was screaming to just get away. "I can't give you a ride," I said, forcing the words out. "I need to get home." He didn't move, just stood there, still blocking my door, his eyes fixed on mine. I glanced around, looking for anyone who might be nearby, but there was no one. Just me and him in that cold, empty gas station. I took a step back, hoping he'd take that as a sign to leave, but he just kept staring at me, that blank expression on his face, like he was weighing something in his mind. "Don't be difficult," he said finally, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I just need a ride." That was when I knew he wasn't going to leave on his own. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to get out of there, to run. But he was still blocking my way to the car, and I didn't know what he'd do if I tried to push past him. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not giving you a ride," I said, each word slow and firm. "Move away from my car." He didn't budge, just looked at me with this strange, almost disappointed expression, like I was letting him down somehow. Then, without a word, he took a step closer, his hand reaching out just enough that I thought he might grab me. I took another step back, my heart racing, and I felt something cold settle over me. This guy wasn't just some stranger asking for help. He'd been watching me, waiting, like he knew I'd be there, like this was planned. I said move, I told him, louder this time, hoping he'd realize I wasn't backing down. He gave me a long, hard look, his eyes narrowing, and for a second, I thought he might do something, that he'd lunge at me. But then he stepped back, just barely enough for me to get to the door. I didn't waste a second. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, all while he stood there, just staring at me through the window, his face inches from the glass. I put the car in reverse, pulling out of the station as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was still watching, if he'd try to follow me. I just drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. For miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see him there, maybe on foot, maybe in a car, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out behind me. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down, not until I was close to home. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me jump. Every creak in the house had me thinking he'd somehow found me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd planned it, that he'd been waiting for someone, maybe anyone, just to pull in there alone. I still think about that night sometimes, every time I'm on a long drive, every time I stop at a gas station on an empty road. I always made sure to look around, to check the shadows, to keep my car between me and anyone who might be around. Because I know that feeling now, the feeling of being watched, of being trapped, and I never want to feel it again. One night, around 11, I headed down to do my laundry in the basement of my apartment complex. I knew it was late, but I work odd hours, and this was the only time I could squeeze it in. The laundry room was always dead quiet, especially at that hour, which suited me just fine. I usually had the whole place to myself, and I could get through it quickly without anyone hovering over the machines. That night, I took my hamper and detergent, went down, and started loading up one of the washers. I noticed right away that the room felt colder than usual. It was a poorly lit space, with only one flickering light bulb overhead. The walls were bare concrete, and it had that musty, almost damp smell that never went away, no matter how much they cleaned it. I tossed in my clothes, filled the machine with detergent, and started it up. I went back upstairs to wait, planning to return in about 40 minutes, just like always. I puttered around my apartment for a bit, tidying up, keeping one eye on the time. When the timer hit 40, I headed back down, expecting to toss my clothes into the dryer and be done with it. But when I got to the laundry room, the washer was empty. I stopped in my tracks, confused, then checked the machine again, wondering if I'd somehow forgotten to put my clothes in. But no, it was the right washer, and I knew I'd started it. My clothes were gone. I thought maybe someone had come down, taken my things out, and left them in the dryer, maybe figuring I'd be back late. Annoyed, I checked all the dryers, but they were all empty too. The room was dead silent. There was no one there. I started to feel uneasy, like maybe I wasn't alone after all. I looked around, listening for any sound that would tell me someone had been there recently, but it was just silent. That cold, empty kind of silence that starts to make your skin prickle. I went back up to my apartment, convinced maybe someone had taken my things by mistake. I waited a while, then went back down, hoping my clothes might have somehow been returned. When I walked into the laundry room, there they were. All my clothes, folded neatly in my basket, right on top of the washing machine. At first, I just felt relief, like, oh good, they're back. But then I realized something was off. Every piece was folded perfectly. I don't mean a sloppy kind of folding. I mean, they were folded like they were in a store display. My shirts were stacked, sleeves aligned perfectly. My jeans were rolled neatly, side by side. Even my socks were matched up and placed in pairs. I don't fold my clothes like that. Not even close. Then the smell hit me. There was this strong scent coming off them, like a man's cologne. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. It was this weird, musky smell that filled the whole room, almost like it had been sprayed on every piece. The scent was overpowering, and it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, clinging to my things. I felt a weird chill go down my spine, and I didn't want to touch my clothes, but I couldn't just leave them. So, I grabbed the basket and practically ran back up to my apartment, that smell following me all the way. I shut and locked my door and just stood there, trying to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. I couldn't understand how my clothes had ended up back there, or why someone would fold them like that, much less put cologne on them. I didn't want to think about it too much. I took them out, shook them out a little, and put them in my closet, just trying to forget about it. But every time I walked past that closet, that smell was there. It didn't fade. My whole apartment started to smell like it. I couldn't escape it. A week passed, and I convinced myself it had just been some weirdo in the building with nothing better to do. I even tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank, even though it didn't feel like that at all. Then, one night, I went down to do laundry again. I was nervous, but I figured it would be fine if I just kept an eye on my things this time. I loaded up the washer, started it, and decided to sit in the laundry room while it ran. I brought my phone and a book, figuring I'd wait it out. About halfway through the cycle, I heard something. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps in the hallway just outside the laundry room. I froze, listening. The steps stopped right outside the door, and I felt my heart start pounding in my chest. I waited, but no one came in. I tried to convince myself it was just someone walking past, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stopped on purpose, like they knew I was in there. The washer finished, and I threw my clothes into the dryer as fast as I could, all while keeping one eye on the door. I sat back down, waiting, the hum of the dryer the only sound. But the smell started to fill the room again. That same musky cologne, faint at first, but then getting stronger, like someone had sprayed it all over the place. I didn't know what to do. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for someone to come in, but no one did. My clothes finished drying, and I grabbed them as fast as I could, stuffing them into my basket without even checking if they were all there. I just wanted to get out of that room. When I got back to my apartment, I went through the clothes one by one, looking for anything strange. Everything was there, but that smell was all over them again. I had no idea how, but it was like it had soaked into the fabric, clinging to each piece, that same strange, musky scent. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside my door, footsteps down the hallway. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, waiting just outside. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that it was just paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. For days, I was on edge. I kept my door locked at all times, and I avoided going to the laundry room unless I absolutely had to. But that smell never faded, no matter how many times I washed my clothes. It was like a reminder, something I couldn't escape, that followed me everywhere I went. Finally, I went down to the building manager, told him everything, how I thought someone was messing with me, leaving my clothes folded, spraying cologne on them. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he said he'd checked the security cameras. I felt a small bit of relief, hoping it would prove I wasn't just imagining it. The next day, he called me into his office. I sat down, nervous, waiting for him to tell me who it was, maybe show me the footage. But he looked at me, almost apologetic, and said there was nothing. The cameras hadn't picked up anyone going in or out of the laundry room that night, or any night I'd mentioned. I couldn't believe it. He said the cameras must have been malfunctioning or maybe pointed in the wrong direction, but that he'd look into it. I could tell he didn't really believe me, but there was nothing more he could do. That was the last time I did laundry in that building. I started going to a laundromat a few blocks away, somewhere crowded, somewhere I felt safe. I'd see people folding their clothes, going through their normal routine, and I'd feel this weird ache, like I'd lost something normal that I'd never get back. The smell faded from my clothes eventually, but every once in a while, I swear I still catch a whiff of it, that same musky cologne, and every time, it brings me right back to that night. I was out fishing by the lake late one night. I liked the quiet, especially on weekdays when no one else really came out that way. The lake was a bit out of the way, and it was mostly locals who knew about it, but most of them didn't come around after dark. I didn't mind, though. I had my flashlight, my tackle box, and I was fine with just a couple hours out there by myself, casting out into the calm water. It was peaceful. The moon was almost full, so I could see pretty well even without the flashlight. It was quiet, just the sound of the water lapping up against the shore, crickets buzzing off in the trees. I cast out a line, settled into my folding chair, and let myself just relax for a bit. I wasn't expecting much to bite that night, but that didn't really matter to me. After a little while, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, down the shore. Just a dark shape at first, not really close, but close enough that I could tell someone else was out there. Another fisherman, it looked like. He didn't have a light on him, which was a bit strange, especially at night, but I figured maybe he was just real comfortable out here in the dark. I didn't pay him too much mind at first, just focused on my own line. Every so often, I'd look over and see him standing there, just a dark outline against the trees. I couldn't see much of him, just that he was tall and sort of hunched over, maybe leaning down to check his line or his tackle. He didn't seem to move much. I thought maybe he was just waiting for a bite, the same as I was. About half an hour went by like that. I'd look up every now and then, and he'd still be there, standing near the edge of the water. He seemed to have moved a little closer, but it was hard to tell for sure in the dark. I shrugged it off, figured he was just walking along the shore to get to a better spot. But then, the next time I looked, he was definitely closer. Maybe only about 30 or 40 feet away now, standing still, facing my direction. It felt strange. Normally, people would call out, make a little conversation, but he was just watching. Or at least, it felt like he was. I couldn't make out his face, couldn't even see if he had any gear on him, but he was standing there like he was waiting for something. I thought about calling out to him, just to break the silence, but something about it made me hesitate. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I felt this knot in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that he was just another guy out fishing, but that feeling wouldn't go away. Then, after a few minutes, he moved again. Just a few steps closer. It was almost like he thought I wouldn't notice if he inched forward slowly enough. Now he was only about 20 feet away, standing right at the water's edge. I could just barely make out his features. He was tall, with a sort of thin, bony build, his clothes looking a bit too loose on him, like they didn't quite fit. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes glinting a bit in the moonlight, just watching me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to focus on my line, tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. I could feel his gaze on me, just waiting. Then, he took another step forward, his shoes making a quiet crunch on the rocks by the shore. I glanced up, hoping he'd maybe say something, explain what he was doing, but he was silent. Just staring. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cleared my throat, my voice coming out a bit shaky, more than I wanted it to. You here for the night too? He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at me. Then, after a long pause, he said, "How long are you planning to stay out here?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, like he didn't want to disturb the quiet around us. But there was something off about it. It felt flat, empty, like he was just saying the words without any real feeling behind them. The way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Not too long," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just until I get a bite or two." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving me. "It's a good night for fishing," he said, his voice still that strange, empty tone. "Not too many people out." "Yeah," I replied, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. "That's why I like it out here." He didn't respond. He just kept watching me, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. Then, without warning, he took another step forward, then another, until he was only about 10 feet away. I gripped my fishing rod tighter, my mind racing. I didn't know what he wanted, but the way he was moving, the way he was just staring, it didn't feel right. I forced myself to stand up, trying to look more confident than I felt. "I think I'm gonna pack up," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Got an early morning tomorrow." He didn't move. Just kept staring at me with those glinting eyes, his face still mostly hidden in shadow. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, almost like he was disappointed. "Yeah," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Didn't catch anything anyway." I started gathering my things, moving as quickly as I could without making it obvious I was rushing. But as I was bending down to grab my tackle box, I heard him take another step forward. I glanced up, and he was even closer now, only about 5 feet away. I could see his face more clearly in the moonlight, his eyes wide, too wide, with a strange intensity that made my stomach twist. "You should stay," he said, his voice softer now, almost like a suggestion. "It's a good night." I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I shoved my gear into my bag. "Maybe some other time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He just watched me, a slight smile creeping onto his face, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel his eyes on me as I finished packing up, his gaze never leaving me. I slung my bag over my shoulder, trying to act casual as I turned to head back toward the path that led to my car. But as I started walking, I heard his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to see that look in his eyes again, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was right there, following me, that same strange smile on his face. I quickened my pace, hoping he'd take the hint and stay behind, but he just matched my speed, staying close enough that I could hear his breathing, shallow and steady, right behind me. Finally, I reached the path and broke into a fast walk, almost a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, never slowing, never speeding up, just keeping that same, steady pace. When I reached the parking lot, I practically ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked up, and he was standing just a few feet away, staring at me through the windshield, that same unsettling smile on his face. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was memorizing my face. I started the engine, my hands still shaking, and pulled out of the lot as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he was still standing there, watching me, that same strange smile on his face, his figure fading into the darkness as I sped down the road. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to see if he was still there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the lake and that strange man were nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. It started as something small. I have this little garden gnome, nothing special, just a cheap thing I bought a few years back. I kept him out by the edge of my flower bed, mostly as a joke. But one night, coming home from work, I noticed he was closer to my front door. Just a couple of feet closer, but definitely not where I'd left him. I thought maybe I'd moved him myself, or a stray animal had bumped him. It was odd, sure, but I didn't think much of it. The next morning, he was back in his usual spot, by the flowers. That's what threw me. I knew he'd been closer the night before. I don't have neighbors who'd mess with me, At least not that I'd ever noticed, and nobody else has a key to my place. It bothered me, but I tried to brush it off. Then it happened again. This time, he was almost at the steps leading up to the door. It was late, after 10, when I got home, and it was just there, a bit too close for comfort. The thing is, it was still the same gnome, same hat, same dumb little smile, but seeing it there in the dark, closer to the house, it made me uneasy. I picked it up, brought it back to the flower bed, and went inside, locking the door behind me. The third night, I came home, and he was halfway up the steps. It was like he was moving closer, slowly, but definitely closer. I just stood there for a moment, staring at it, that same unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. This wasn't random. Someone was moving it. I couldn't shake that feeling. I looked around, even called out, "Hello?" But there was nothing, just the usual quiet of my neighborhood. I put the gnome back by the flower bed and went inside, more irritated than anything. I decided I'd set up my phone to record out front the next night. I was going to catch whoever was doing this and put an end to it. The next day was long, and by the time I got home, I was more tired than anything. But I remembered my plan, so I set my phone on the windowsill, facing the front porch. I didn't expect much, but it was something. I locked up, double-checked the windows, and tried to forget about it as I went to bed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something. A soft, scratching sound, like someone or something outside. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding, waiting to hear it again. Then, nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was the wind or maybe a stray animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In the morning, I checked my phone. It had recorded for hours, but there was nothing unusual until about 2:58 a.m. The screen went blurry, the angle shifting just a bit, but I could see the porch clearly enough. At 3:01 a.m., something moved on the left side of the frame. It was hard to see, but it looked like a hand. Just a glimpse of fingers curling around the corner of the porch, and then the gnome was there, closer to the steps again. I watched it 3 times, my heart sinking each time. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there, moving the gnome. And now, they were getting bolder, creeping around my house in the middle of the night. It wasn't just a prank or a joke anymore. It felt like something else, something darker. I moved the gnome back to the flower bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to every sound, waiting to hear that scratching noise again. But the night passed quietly, and by morning, the gnome was still in the flower bed. I felt almost relieved, like maybe whoever it was had finally gotten bored and moved on. But the night after, I came home to find the gnome right by the door. Just sitting there on the mat, staring up at me with that same dumb smile. It sent a chill through me. Whoever was doing this wasn't just messing around anymore. They were trying to scare me. And it was working. I grabbed the gnome, threw it in the back of my car, and drove to the other side of town. I tossed it in a dumpster behind a gas station, feeling a bit ridiculous but also relieved. I figured that would be the end of it. No more gnome, no more creepy midnight visits. That night, I slept better, feeling like I'd finally gotten rid of whatever had been bothering me. But the next morning, I opened my front door, and there it was. The same gnome, right on my doorstep. It looked dirtier, a little scuffed, but it was the same one. I felt a jolt of fear, like ice water running through my veins. This wasn't random. Whoever was doing this knew what they were doing, knew how to get under my skin. I felt trapped, like someone was watching, waiting. I took the gnome and threw it out again, this time in a trash bin right in my building's parking lot, hoping that would finally end it. That night, I heard something outside again, but this time it was different. A shuffling closer, like someone was right outside my window. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. It went on for what felt like an eternity, and then I heard a soft chuckle, barely audible, like someone was laughing to themselves. I stayed frozen, too scared to move, until the sound finally stopped. In the morning, I went out to the porch, and the gnome was there again. And this time, there was something else. A footprint, faint, right next to the doormat. Whoever was doing this had been close, right outside my door. I called the police, told them about everything. They took a report, looked around, but they didn't find anything. They said it was probably a prank, told me to get some cameras installed. But I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They left, and I was alone again. That night, I stayed up, watching out the window, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I saw movement near the bushes by my porch. A shadow, shifting, just out of sight. My heart was pounding, but I stayed still, watching. And then, I saw him. A man, crouched down in the bushes, just watching my house. He was tall, thin, with a scruffy beard and dark clothes. He was holding something in his hand, maybe a piece of paper, I couldn't tell. I felt a wave of fear, but I forced myself to keep watching, not wanting to make any noise. After a few minutes, he crept closer to the porch, holding the gnome in his hand. He set it down by the steps, like he'd done before, and then he just stood there, staring at my door, like he was waiting for me to come out. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, hoping he wouldn't notice me watching. After what felt like forever, he finally turned and disappeared back into the bushes. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then grabbed my phone and called the police again. They came out, searched the area, but again, they didn't find anything. They told me to keep my doors locked and get some cameras. I ordered some that night, but it didn't help me feel any safer. The next morning, the gnome was gone. I thought maybe the man had finally taken it, maybe he was done with his game. But every time I left the house after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that he was still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment. It's been weeks now, and I haven't seen the gnome or the man again. But I still feel uneasy, like he's watching, waiting for the next time he can come back. I've got the cameras up now. I keep my doors locked, but that feeling hasn't gone away. And I don't think it ever will. I was sitting there, waiting for the train in the cold, empty station. It was late, past midnight, and there wasn't another soul around except for this one guy across from me. I didn't pay him much attention at first. I was tired, nodding off a bit, just wanting the train to show up so I could get home. But I started to feel something, like someone's eyes on me. I looked up, and there he was, staring right at me. At first, I thought he was just some tired guy, zoning out, maybe looking in my direction by accident. I looked away, shifted in my seat, tried to ignore it. But every time I looked up, he was staring. Not moving, just looking at me. His eyes were wide, intense, and it felt like they were cutting right through me. He didn't blink, didn't shift his weight. Just stared, like he knew me or something, like he was waiting for me to do something. I felt uneasy. It's hard to explain, but there was something wrong about his stare, like it was too focused, too personal. I decided to get up, put a little space between us. So, I walked over to a different bench, closer to where the train was supposed to come. I sat down, took out my phone, tried to look busy, but I could still feel it, that feeling of being watched. And sure enough, a few moments later, I see him out of the corner of my eye. He'd gotten up too. He walked over to my new bench, real slow, like he was taking his time, enjoying it or something. He sat down right next to me, not across, not a couple of seats away. Right next to me, close enough that I could feel him breathing, smell the faint scent of something stale on him, like old cigarettes and sweat. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, looking forward. I could see him from the corner of my eye, that same intense, unblinking stare. Finally, he leaned over, real close to my ear, and he whispered, "Why did you move?" It sent a chill down my spine. His voice was raspy, quiet, like he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though it was just the two of us. I didn't know what to say, so I just mumbled something about wanting to be closer to the tracks. He smiled, a slow, strange smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then he said, "You shouldn't have moved." I felt my skin prickle, like he was trying to get a reaction out of me. I thought maybe he was drunk or just looking to mess with someone. I turned slightly, trying to look away, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He leaned closer, like he had something to share, like he knew a secret. He whispered again, barely a breath this time, "You shouldn't be out here alone." It was such a strange thing to say, and it felt like a threat, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't know how to respond, so I just muttered something about how I was fine, how the train was coming soon. I was trying to keep calm, but I could feel my pulse quickening. He didn't say anything else for a while, just kept sitting there, too close, too still. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking again, and this time he was talking about me. "You live over on Oak Street, don't you?" he said, like it was the most casual thing in the world. I froze. Oak Street was where I lived, but I'd never seen this guy before, never even talked to him. My mind raced, trying to figure out how he could know that. I managed to stammer, "How do you know where I live?" But he just laughed, this low, scratchy laugh that didn't sound right. He looked at me, that smile creeping back onto his face, and said, "I know more than that. I know you get home around this time most nights. I know you stop at that little coffee shop on the way. I know you don't like the dark." I felt my heart pound harder, my chest tightening. I didn't know how he knew these things. I hadn't seen him before, hadn't told anyone where I lived or what my routine was. It was like he'd been watching me, keeping track, but why? And for how long? I tried to get up, tried to put some distance between us, but he grabbed my wrist, tight, his fingers digging in like claws. I could feel the roughness of his skin, and his grip was stronger than I expected. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was enjoying the fear he could see in me. I need to get something from my bag," I lied, trying to stay calm. He didn't let go, not right away. He stared at me, searching my face, and then finally, he let go, but he didn't move. He just sat there, watching as I stood up, his head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something. I backed away, slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and moved to another bench, further down the platform. But he didn't stay put for long. A minute later, he was on his feet, walking toward me, that slow, deliberate pace again. He didn't break eye contact, didn't blink. It was like he was trying to make me feel as uncomfortable as possible, like he was enjoying it. He sat down next to me again, close enough that our knees almost touched, and he leaned in, that grin back on his face. "I knew you'd move again," he whispered. "I knew you couldn't stay still." I didn't say anything. I was too scared. My mouth felt dry, and I could feel my hands shaking. I tried to look away, to pretend he wasn't there, but he reached out, grabbing my chin, turning my face toward him. His grip was firm, his fingers cold. He looked into my eyes, and there was something in his gaze, something dark, something wrong. "You know I could follow you," he said softly, his voice almost gentle, but his eyes were full of something sharp, something that felt like it was slicing into me. I could follow you all the way home, and no one would know. No one would see. I felt a surge of panic. I yanked my face away, scrambling to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't care about being polite anymore, didn't care if I looked crazy. I just wanted to get away from him. I backed up, moving toward the edge of the platform, closer to where the security cameras were, hoping they'd catch whatever was happening. He didn't follow me this time. He just sat there, smiling, watching me, his head tilted, his eyes never leaving me. I stayed near the cameras, my hands shaking, waiting for the train, praying it would come soon. He didn't move, didn't come any closer, but he kept watching, his smile never fading. Finally, I heard the rumble of the train in the distance. Relief washed over me, and I stepped closer to the edge, ready to get on, ready to put as much distance between me and this man as possible. But just as the train pulled up, he stood up, took a few steps toward me, and said one last thing. "I'll see you soon." The train doors opened, and I practically jumped inside, my heart racing. I didn't look back as the doors closed, didn't look to see if he was still standing there, watching. I just sat down, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was, didn't know how he knew so much about me, but I knew I never wanted to see him again. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been serious, that he'd find me again, somehow. I kept the lights on, kept the doors locked, and tried to tell myself it was over. But deep down, I knew he wasn't done with me. Not yet. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I had just finished a long shift at the office. I was tired, my mind was foggy, and all I wanted to do was get home and get some sleep. My car was running fine, nothing unusual. But as I turned down a quiet stretch of road, my engine sputtered, and then it just died. I tried restarting it a few times, but nothing happened. I knew I was far from the nearest gas station or anything resembling help. The road was dark, only a few houses scattered here and there, far enough that they couldn't help me in time if something went wrong. I didn't panic, though. I was prepared for moments like this. I pulled out my phone, got on the roadside assistance app, and requested a tow. The app said it would be about 40 minutes before help arrived. Fine. I could wait. I stayed in the car, locked the doors, and tried to make myself comfortable as best I could. About 15 minutes later, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was the tow truck, but the truck kept getting closer and closer, then pulled up next to me. I glanced over, and the driver rolled down his window. "Hey, need a hand?" he asked. I looked over at him. He was in a beat-up pickup truck, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt. At first, I thought he might be a good Samaritan, someone trying to help. But then I noticed something in his eyes, something that made me hesitant. His stare was a little too intense, a little too focused. It felt wrong, like he was eyeing me more than my car. "No, I'm fine," I said, trying to sound calm and polite. "I've called for a tow truck. They should be here soon." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me for a moment, his eyes flicking over my car like he was inspecting it, and then he said, "You sure? I could take a look, help you out. You don't want to wait out here alone." I shook my head. "Really, I'm fine. The tow truck's on the way." There was a long pause. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something in the air changed. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I knew something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me or how he hadn't left after I told him I was fine. Then, without saying another word, the man shifted the truck into reverse and slowly started to circle around my car, driving in a wide arc. I watched him through the rearview mirror, feeling uneasy as he drove past me and came around again, slowly, like he was studying the car. I looked around quickly, checking if there were any other cars, any lights from a nearby house. But everything around me was dark. Empty. I locked my doors and rolled up the windows, just to be sure. He kept driving in circles, coming around again and again, like he was looking for something. I started to feel my heart beat faster. Why wasn't he leaving? I didn't need help. Why wasn't he going? I leaned over to grab my phone, thinking I might need to call the tow truck again, or maybe even call the police. But just as I reached for my phone, the truck stopped right in front of me. I froze, my hand still on the phone, unsure if I should make the call or if I was overreacting. The man leaned out of the window, his body half out of the truck, and looked right at me. You sure you don't need help? Looks like you're stuck out here all alone. I could just give you a ride home, get you out of here. His voice had changed. It was softer now, but there was an edge to it, something cold underneath. No, thank you, I said, forcing myself to sound firm. I'm fine. I'm waiting for a tow. Please just go. But instead of leaving, the man did something that made my stomach drop. He got out of the truck and started walking toward my car, not fast, just slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I froze. I felt like I was being watched, studied, trapped in this moment. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to think quickly. I couldn't just sit there. I started the car again, hoping it would work, praying the engine would turn over, but it didn't. Of course it didn't. My only option was to wait. But waiting felt dangerous now. I could see the man approaching the car through the side mirror, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He reached the back of my car, then circled to the front, looking down at the ground like he was inspecting it. I swallowed hard, my breath coming faster now. I didn't know what to do. I tried to think about what I had in the car. There was nothing to use for defense, nothing close enough that I could reach. The man stood by the front of my car for a moment, just staring at the hood, before he leaned down, peering through the windshield at me. He knocked on the window, gently at first. I didn't move, didn't speak. My whole body was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it could protect me. The man knocked again, this time harder. You know, he said, his voice low, you could at least talk to me. It's not safe out here, especially when you're so far from home. I could help you out. I didn't answer him. I just stared straight ahead, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying not to show how afraid I was. He wasn't just offering help. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting for me to make a move. He stepped back from the car, walked around to the other side, and began to check the passenger side. I could hear the crunch of gravel under his boots as he circled my car again, moving with that slow, methodical pace, like he was searching for something. I watched him through the rearview mirror, trying to calm myself, thinking about what to do next. The tow truck was supposed to be close by. Maybe I could just wait him out. But what if he didn't leave? What if he tried to get in? He came back to the driver's side again and knocked on the window. This time, I jumped. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel the panic rising. Don't make me break that window, he said softly, like it was a casual threat. I can see you're scared, but I'm just trying to help. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I reached for my phone, but just before I could call the police, I saw headlights in the distance. The tow truck. I had never been so relieved to see anything in my life. The man saw the headlights too. He looked back at me, then back at the truck, and his expression changed. The smile faded from his face, and he took a step back. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the tow truck pull up. I didn't move, didn't take my eyes off him. The tow truck driver was a big guy, looked like someone who had seen enough strange situations to not be easily intimidated. When he got out of the truck, the man's eyes flicked between us. He stayed there for another few seconds, then turned and walked back to his truck. "Are you okay?" the tow truck driver asked, eyeing me carefully. I nodded, trying to calm my breathing. "I am now." The man got into his truck and started it up. He didn't say another word. He just backed out of the spot and drove off, disappearing into the night. I didn't stay to watch him leave. As soon as the tow truck driver finished loading my car, I got in, locked the doors, and told him to just take me home. I didn't care about anything else. I just wanted to be as far away from that man as possible. I made it home safely that night, but I still think about it sometimes. How close I came to something worse. How that man didn't just leave when I asked him to. How he just kept circling, looking for a way in. Something about him felt wrong from the start, and I'm just glad I didn't give him the chance to prove it. It happened last fall. I remember the night because I was running late for work, and I just made the decision to take a shortcut. I had just gotten off the bus, and my office was still a 10-minute walk ahead, but I knew there was a construction site in the middle of the block, and if I cut through, I could save at least 5 minutes. I had walked through that site many times before. It was quiet after hours, and there was never anyone around. It was dark, but I wasn't worried about that. There were streetlights lining the street and enough ambient light that I could see the path ahead of me. Still, I had the unsettling feeling of being alone, like everything around me was too still, but I shook it off. I just needed to get to work, so I walked toward the site. As I approached the entrance, I could hear the usual noises, tools and materials piled up, the remnants of the day's work. The path was pretty simple, just a wide space between piles of metal rods and construction debris, but the area was dim. I could barely make out the edges of the sidewalk, so I had to watch where I was stepping. But nothing seemed off. I just kept walking, trying to hurry up a little since I had about 10 minutes before I was supposed to be at my desk. After a few steps, I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a sound that I couldn't ignore. Footsteps. I stopped and listened. For a second, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard them again. Slow, heavy steps, echoing off the steel beams and concrete walls. My heart jumped in my chest, and I turned around. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps were still there, faint but undeniably close. I didn't panic at first. It was just a construction worker, maybe. Maybe they had stayed late, or maybe someone else was taking the shortcut, too. I didn't see anyone else, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace. My mind was racing, but I tried to keep my footsteps calm. I didn't want to look like I was running from nothing. I glanced back once more, but the only thing I saw was the stretch of concrete ahead. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming, matching my pace. That's when I started to feel the real weight of it. Something about the sound, the fact that it was getting closer, made my stomach churn. I quickened my step, trying to move faster through the narrow alley between construction crates and abandoned machinery. But the footsteps, still slow at first, sped up too. Whoever was behind me wasn't keeping their distance anymore. They were getting closer, following my every move. I looked ahead, saw nothing but dark shadows cast by the scattered light from the street behind me. There was no clear exit. The sight stretched on, just a long series of twists and turns with walls and debris blocking the way. I tried to stay calm, tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a person walking at the same pace, but no, something about the sound felt deliberate, almost like whoever was behind me was pacing me, waiting for the moment I would speed up. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears now, and the footsteps kept getting closer. I was definitely not imagining it anymore. They were right behind me, close enough that I could almost hear breathing. I broke into a jog. I didn't think. I just did it. I needed to get out. I needed to get away from whatever was following me. The area was still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The sound of those footsteps was relentless, echoing in the darkness. As I ran, I heard the footsteps pick up speed too, gaining on me. The sound was louder, closer, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I had no idea what kind of person I was dealing with, and I wasn't about to find out. My mind raced as I tried to figure out where I could go. My feet hit the cracked pavement as I turned a corner. There was a small alleyway ahead, and I thought if I could make it there, I could at least break the line of sight. But I didn't make it. The sound of footsteps behind me shifted, and for a split second, I thought I'd lost whoever was following. But then I heard them turn the corner. They were still there. They were still following me. I could feel them gaining on me. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming from the effort, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. The alley was just ahead, but I wasn't sure I could make it. The chase was on now, and I could hear the person's footsteps just a few steps behind me, growing closer, echoing louder in the dark. Every breath felt sharp, and my legs were starting to give out. I saw the alleys opening up ahead and pushed myself harder. Finally, I made it to the corner, turned it, and broke into the next part of the site. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I was still moving. I thought I could make it to the exit just a little farther down the road, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could run like this. I felt the cold in my chest, the fear sinking in deeper with every step. Just as I thought I might be in the clear, I heard a voice. "Hey!" It was low, but it rang clear in the night air. I didn't look back, but I felt my whole body go cold. That voice. It wasn't just someone trying to get my attention. It was threatening. It was saying my name. I couldn't hear any more footsteps now, just a voice, followed by more sounds, footsteps shifting closer, faster. I was running on adrenaline now, my chest tight, my eyes scanning the darkness. And then, finally, just as I reached what I thought was the exit, I heard the sound I was dreading, the screech of metal against concrete. I spun around, my heart racing as I saw the figure in the distance, running toward me now, faster than before. I didn't want to look, didn't want to believe it was happening. I had to get away. I had to find help. I heard a shout, a harsh, demanding voice yelling after me. But I didn't stop. I pushed through the gate and sprinted onto the street. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for anything, anyone. Cars, lights, people, anything. I wasn't going to stop until I saw someone. My breath came in ragged bursts, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let this person get any closer. I wasn't going to let them catch me. When I finally reached a streetlight, I stopped. My chest heaved with exhaustion, my mind still racing. The chase had ended. No one was behind me anymore. I hadn't heard those footsteps for a while. I kept walking, faster now, until I reached a corner where there was a busy street. I didn't see anyone follow me. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I felt like I could finally breathe again. When I finally made it to work, I told my boss I was late, but I didn't go into detail. They would never believe me, not about the footsteps, not about the chase. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't over. And I knew I couldn't take that shortcut again. I never walked that route again, and to this day, I haven't. That fear, the feeling of being followed, still lingers in the back of my mind. Something about that night still feels like it's waiting for me, just around the corner. It was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for hours, on my way to visit family, and I was just over halfway through my trip. The highway stretched on for miles, and I could feel my eyelids getting heavier as I drove. I hadn't planned on stopping, but the tiredness hit me harder than I expected, so I pulled off at the next rest area. It wasn't much, just a small lot with a few scattered cars. There was a dim light by the bathroom, and the rest of the area was dark and quiet, save for a few distant trucks parked along the far end. I didn't think twice about it. I figured I'd just take a quick break, stretch my legs, maybe rest my eyes for a few minutes. I parked near the edge, where there weren't many cars. It felt safer that way, more isolated. I locked the doors and reclined the seat back a bit. It was comfortable enough for a quick nap, but I kept the engine running. The last thing I wanted was to wake up to a dead battery after trying to rest. I hadn't been in the car for more than 20 minutes when I heard the tap on my window. At first, I thought it was just someone walking past, but the tap came again, louder this time, a little insistent. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. I didn't expect anyone to be around, especially not in the middle of the night. I turned my head, and there was a man standing outside my window, his face barely visible in the dark. He was wearing a uniform, but not the kind I expected. He had a badge clipped to his shirt, which looked like some kind of police badge. But something about it didn't sit right. It was too shiny, too new looking. "Ma'am," he said, tapping on the glass again, his voice muffled by the window, "I need you to roll down the window." I didn't move at first. The whole situation felt strange. It was late, there was barely anyone around, and I had never seen a cop like him before. The uniform seemed off too. The stitching wasn't right, and I could see the badge wasn't sewn the way it should be. It just didn't look real. I didn't even want to think about why someone would be pretending to be a cop in the middle of nowhere at that hour. I didn't open the window. Instead, I just looked at him through the glass. He stood there for a moment, almost like he was expecting me to comply. When I didn't move, he said, "I'm Officer Wilson. You've been parked here for a while. Just making sure everything's okay." I didn't recognize his name, but then again, I wasn't familiar with this area at all. I still didn't trust him, so I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching him. He tried again. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." "Roll down the window." I looked at him a bit longer, my mind racing. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure if he was legitimate or if something wasn't right. A real officer wouldn't approach someone like this. They wouldn't tap on a window in the middle of the night and try to get me to open up when I was clearly in the middle of resting. I decided to speak up, my voice shaky but firm. "I'm not comfortable rolling down the window. What do you need?" He hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't expecting me to question him. His eyes flicked to the side, and I could see him adjusting his stance a little, like he was preparing to say something else. "I'm just checking in," he said, a little too casually. "I've been making rounds, and I saw you parked here. You should be more careful, especially this time of night. Not many people stop here. You never know who's around." I felt my stomach tighten. His words didn't make sense. If he was truly a cop, he wouldn't be acting this way. He would have just asked to see my ID, maybe run a quick check on the car, but he was trying to make me feel like I was in danger, trying to intimidate me into rolling the window down. "No, thank you," I replied. "I'm fine. I'm just resting. I'm not bothering anyone." I could see him look at me with a slight frown. He didn't like my refusal, and I could tell that he was adjusting his approach now. He shifted his weight again, taking a step back before leaning in closer to the window. "You know," he said in a low voice, "I could write you up for loitering here. It's against the rules to park after dark. It's unsafe for a woman to be here alone." His words made me tense up. I had no idea what the rules were in this rest area, but he was making things up now, trying to intimidate me further. His voice had dropped even lower, more threatening, and I could hear the sharpness in his tone. I felt a wave of dread hit me, and every instinct in my body told me to get out of there. I wasn't sure what his game was, but I knew one thing for certain: he was not a cop. There was no way someone in law enforcement would act like this. And no real officer would demand I open my window in the middle of nowhere, especially when there was nothing suspicious going on. The whole thing felt wrong. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at him, but I knew I had to get out. I wasn't going to roll down the window, and I wasn't going to let him get any closer. I decided that I needed to leave. Now! I started the car up without saying anything else. He looked taken aback, surprised that I wasn't going to engage any further. As I started to drive away, I saw him step back quickly, almost stumbling, his face now completely visible in the dim light. He wasn't wearing a police uniform after all. It was just a jacket that resembled one, but it wasn't real. I didn't catch his full face, but I could see enough of it to know he was trying to deceive me. There was something off about him. His face was pale, his eyes too wide, and his mouth twisted in an unnatural way. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I kept my foot on the gas, and I didn't stop until I found a gas station with bright lights and people milling about. I stayed there for a while, my heart still racing, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was over. I was safe now. That night changed everything. I always made sure to double-check everything before I trust someone who approaches me, especially at night. I learned the hard way to trust my instincts, and that feeling of something being off is never wrong. Even now, I can't help but think about that man, wondering how many others he's tried to pull this with. I worked the night shift at a parking garage downtown. Not the most exciting job, but it was decent money, and I didn't have to deal with too many people, which suited me just fine. It was mostly business types coming in and out during the day, but by night, it got pretty empty. Just a few late-night stragglers who'd forgotten where they parked, or people on their way out after a long shift. My job was to keep an eye on things, check the cameras, make sure no one was breaking into the cars. There was a small booth I worked out of on the ground floor near the entrance. Just me, a chair, a tiny desk with a monitor hooked up to the security cameras, and a vending machine that only took exact change. The garage itself had 5 floors, with dim lighting, so shadows seemed to stretch everywhere. Sound carried strangely in there, echoing down the ramps and bouncing off the concrete walls. A few months into the job, I started noticing something weird. Every now and then, I hear footsteps. At first, I'd think it was just a late-night driver heading to their car, but then I'd look at the monitor, and there'd be no one on any of the cameras. It wasn't constant, just every so often, usually in the dead quiet of the early hours when the place was completely empty. Sometimes it'd sound like they were just a floor above me, sometimes closer, like they were right around the corner. I hear them pause, wait for the person to appear on one of the cameras, but no one ever did. One night, I got curious and decided to go up and check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up to the second floor. The echo of my own footsteps bounced off the walls, making the place feel twice as big and twice as empty. I walked up the ramps, my light cutting through the shadows, but I didn't see anything. It was just quiet, with the low hum of the lights buzzing overhead. Then, as I turned to head back down, I heard footsteps, soft but steady, coming from the third floor above me. I froze, trying to listen, my heart pounding a little faster. They sounded slow, like someone just strolling along, not in any hurry. I took a breath and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" My voice echoed back at me, but there was no answer. The footsteps just stopped. I waited a minute, listening, but everything was silent again. I told myself it was probably just a sound carrying from the street outside, or maybe some kind of weird echo. I shrugged it off and went back to the booth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After that, the footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear them a couple of times a night, always when I was alone, always when the garage was empty. They'd start out faint, then get closer, like someone was making their way down to the ground floor. I checked the cameras, scanned the floors, but there was never anyone there. One night, around 3 a.m., it happened again. I was in the booth, half asleep, when I heard the footsteps. This time, they sounded like they were right outside the booth. I shot up, heart racing, and looked out through the glass. The garage was empty. But the footsteps were still there, moving away from me now, heading toward the back of the garage. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and shone the beam down the row of parked cars. Nothing. Is someone there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I stood there for a minute, feeling stupid, waiting for something to happen. But the footsteps had stopped again. The garage was silent. I decided to do a full sweep of the place, just to put my mind at ease. I walked up each level, shining my light into every corner, checking behind the pillars and parked cars. Everything was still, empty. When I got to the 5th floor, I stopped for a minute to catch my breath. The whole place was dead silent, not even a car engine humming in the distance. Then, just as I was about to head back down, I heard a voice. It was soft, like someone talking to themselves, muttering, but it echoed off the concrete, and I couldn't make out what they were saying. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned, shining my light down the rows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The muttering stopped. I took a few steps forward, peering around a pillar, and that's when I saw him. A man was crouched down between 2 parked cars, his back to me. He was wearing dark clothes, his head down, hands fidgeting with something I couldn't see. "Hey!" I called out, a bit louder this time. He didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at me. I took another step forward, keeping my flashlight on him. "What are you doing here?" He finally turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, staring at me with this intense, almost hungry look. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just looked right at me, like he was sizing me up. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Waiting for me? What do you mean?" He didn't answer, just kept staring at me. I took a step back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound firm. "This is private property. You can't be here." He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact. "I've seen you here, every night," he said. You don't know it, but I've been watching. My mouth went dry. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else, but it was just the two of us, alone on the top floor of an empty parking garage. Look, I said, I don't know what you're talking about, but you need to go. Now. He took a step toward me, and I felt my heart hammering against my chest. I know things about you, he whispered. Things you don't even know about yourself. That was enough for me. I took another step back, turning to make a run for the stairs. But before I could move, I heard him laugh, a low, chilling sound that echoed off the walls. You can't run from me, he said, his voice following me down the stairwell as I bolted down to the lower levels. I didn't stop until I was back at the booth, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, barely able to get the words out as I told them there was a man in the garage, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who'd been following me. They said they'd send someone over right away, told me to stay in the booth and keep the door locked. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the monitor. The camera showed all the floors, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Just empty concrete, silent and still. I kept watching, my eyes darting from screen to screen, waiting for him to appear. When the cops finally arrived, they did a full sweep of the garage, checking every floor, every corner. But they didn't find anyone. No sign of the man, no footprints, nothing. They told me he was probably just some homeless guy, someone looking for a place to sleep. But I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me, the things he said, it felt personal. After that night, I quit. I couldn't go back to that garage, couldn't stand the thought of being there alone, listening to those footsteps, waiting for him to find me again. Even now, I sometimes feel like he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And every now and then, late at night, I swear I can hear footsteps, following me, just out of sight. When hiking alone in Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park last summer, I had heard about the park's stunning views and wanted to explore it on my own. There was something peaceful about being in the wilderness, away from everything. I parked my car at the trailhead and started my hike early in the morning, excited to see the sights. The sun was just rising, casting a warm glow over the canyon walls. I followed the trail, taking my time to soak it all in. The air was crisp and clean, and the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was calming. I stopped now and then to take pictures, capturing the beauty of the towering cliffs and the winding river below. After a while, I noticed a woman about 50 yards behind me. At first, I thought she was just another hiker. She wore a bright red jacket, which stood out against the dark rocks and trees. I glanced back a few times, and each time, I saw her still trailing behind. She kept her distance but moved in the same direction as me. I felt a flicker of unease but tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just enjoying the same trail. I continued walking, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, like someone had their eyes on me. I quickened my pace, hoping to create some distance. Each time I looked back, I saw her, always there, always watching. It was like a shadow that refused to disappear. I decided to stop at a lookout point to take a break. The view was breathtaking, and I thought maybe some time alone would help me relax. I sat on a rock, pulled out my water bottle, and took a long drink. I listened to the sounds of nature around me, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds. For a moment, I felt at peace. That peace shattered when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see the woman in the red jacket standing a few feet away from me. She smiled, but there was something off about it. "Hi there," she said. "I've been following you for a bit." Hi, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. I didn't realize anyone was behind me. I just wanted to make sure you were okay, she said, taking a step closer. You know, hiking alone can be dangerous. I appreciate that, I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. But I've hiked here before. Her smile widened, but it felt forced. Still, it is always good to have someone watching out for you. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Thanks, I guess. Do you come here often? She asked, her eyes scanning my face like she was looking for something. Not really. This is my first time at this park, I said, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. She took another step forward, closing the distance. Oh, so you are from out of town? Where are you staying? Just in town for a few days, I said, trying to keep my answer short. I have a hotel room. What hotel? She pressed, her tone shifting slightly. I would rather not say, I said, my heart racing. I felt like I was being cornered, like she was digging for information I was not willing to give. Come on, I just want to know more about you. I can help you if you are new here. There are some great places to explore. Her voice was sweet, but it held an edge. I felt like she was probing, trying to find a way in. I'm fine on my own, really, I said, forcing a smile. She looked disappointed, but she did not give up. What do you do for a living? Just a job, I said. I had no interest in sharing anything more. Just a job? She laughed, and it felt too loud in the stillness of the canyon. Everyone has dreams, you know. What are yours? I could feel her eyes on me, searching, and I started to feel trapped. I glanced around, hoping someone else would come along. I think I should get going, I said, standing up. Why don't you stay a little longer? You have no idea how beautiful it is here, she said, her voice dropping to a softer tone. You can't rush these things. I really should go, I said, stepping back. Why are you so afraid? She asked suddenly, her expression changing. I just want to help you. You need to let me in. Her words made my skin crawl. I turned and started walking away, trying to stay calm. Where are you going? She called after me, her voice sharp now. You can't just leave. I picked up my pace, fear flooding through me. I could hear her footsteps behind me, the sound growing closer. I'm not following you, I shouted, trying to put distance between us. Why are you running? She yelled. I'm just trying to help. I didn't look back. I could feel her gaining on me, the air feeling thick and heavy. I thought about my phone, about calling for help, but my mind was racing. I just needed to get away from her. I turned a corner on the trail, praying for a break in the trees or any sign of other hikers. Suddenly, I saw two people up ahead, walking towards me. I felt a surge of hope. Hey! I shouted, waving my arms. Help! The woman in the red jacket stopped in her tracks, her face contorting in anger. I sprinted toward the couple, shouting for them to come closer. What is happening? One of them asked, looking confused. She's following me. I cried, pointing back at the woman. The couple turned, and the woman in the red jacket took a step back. I was just trying to help her, she exclaimed, but her voice lacked conviction. Stay back, I shouted, feeling a wave of adrenaline. The couple moved closer to me, forming a barrier. Are you okay? One of them asked. Not really. She won't leave me alone, I said, my heart racing. The woman in the red jacket narrowed her eyes, her expression shifting from feigned friendliness to something darker. You don't need them. You need to trust me, she said, her voice low. "Get away from her," one of the hikers shouted. The woman stepped back, but I could see the anger in her eyes. "You will regret this," she said, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing back down the trail. I took a shaky breath, my body trembling. "Thank you," I said to the couple, who were now standing close. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Just stay with us for a bit," one of them said. "We will walk you back to the trailhead." I nodded, grateful for their presence. The hike back felt longer than the way in, but I felt safer knowing they were beside me. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the woman following us again, but there was no sign of her. When we finally reached the parking area, I could see my car and felt a rush of relief. I thanked the couple again before quickly getting in and locking the doors. I drove away, my heart still pounding. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road as I left the park. I thought about how quickly things had turned, how a simple hike had become a terrifying experience. I promised myself I would never hike alone again. The wilderness could be beautiful, but it could also hold darkness, and I would be more careful in the future. I'd been planning that hike in Olympic National Park for months. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere out of the way. Just me, a long trail, and maybe a couple of nights alone with my thoughts. I'd done solo hikes before, but nothing this secluded, and that's why I picked it. No people, no crowds, just miles of forest. I started early in the morning, parked the car at the trailhead, double-checked my backpack, and set out. The trees were thick and tall, stretching overhead and casting shadows, even in the early light. The trail was winding, narrow, cutting through the thick underbrush. It was a little damp, too. Mist was hanging between the trees, so it felt like stepping into some other world. A few hours in, I stopped for a break. I'd barely seen any other footprints on the trail, which suited me just fine. Just trees and the smell of pine and moss, thick in the air. I sat down, drank some water, and listened to the wind in the branches, the occasional bird call. It was peaceful. I didn't want to leave, but after a few minutes, I got up and kept moving. That's when I noticed it. I heard the snap of a twig, far off, but close enough to be something solid. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake this odd feeling. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, telling myself it was nothing. Just the sound of the forest, right? But something about it felt wrong. I kept going, trying to ignore it. After another hour, the feeling got stronger. Every so often, I hear a crunch of leaves or the creak of a branch from somewhere behind me, just out of sight. I'd turn, and there'd be nothing. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Something was definitely back there. But there was no quick rustling of a rabbit, no big shuffle like a bear. It was careful. Almost too careful. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and turned around, staring down the path, waiting for any movement. I squinted into the distance, through the trees, trying to pick out any sign of something unusual. And that's when I saw him. He was standing a good distance away, leaning casually against a tree. He was wearing a dark jacket, a hat that shadowed his face. His arms were crossed, and he wasn't moving. Just watching. I felt this chill go through me, like the forest suddenly got colder. He didn't wave, didn't call out, nothing. He just stood there, too far away to make out any features, but close enough that I knew he was looking right at me. I tried to act calm, tried to ignore the weird feeling in my gut. Maybe he was another hiker. I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead, but it was possible someone else had come in later. I gave him a nod, kind of half-hearted, and turned back, picked up my pace. After a while, I glanced back again, just to see. He was closer. Not right behind me, but closer than before, walking slow, hands in his pockets. I felt my stomach drop. He was following me. There was no mistaking it now. I sped up, putting more distance between us, but every time I looked back, he'd be there, the same calm, steady walk, like he had all the time in the world. I told myself I'd just keep moving, that he'd lose interest eventually. But he didn't. I walked faster, almost a jog now, and he kept pace, that same slow, unhurried walk. I kept going, glancing back every few minutes. He was always there, like he knew exactly how fast to go so he wouldn't lose me. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and spun around, trying to sound firm, trying not to let my voice shake. "Hey!" I called out. "Can I help you with something?" He stopped too, standing still, and tilted his head, like he was thinking about it. Then he smiled. Not a big grin, not friendly, just a small, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at me and said, "I was wondering when you'd notice." The way he said it, like he'd been waiting for me, like this whole thing had been some game to him, it made my blood run cold. He didn't move, just kept that smile, like he knew something I didn't. I forced myself to stay calm, told myself not to show any fear, but it was hard. My mind was racing, and all I could think was that I needed to get out of there. I turned around, picked up my pace again, almost breaking into a run. I didn't care about the trail or my gear or anything. I just needed to put distance between us. I thought about going off the trail, but the woods were thick, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. The only way out was forward. I kept glancing back, hoping he'd be gone, but every time, he was closer. That slow walk, always the same pace, but somehow, he kept getting nearer. I tried to keep calm, tried to tell myself he was just another hiker, maybe playing some weird joke. But I knew that wasn't it. He wasn't laughing, wasn't saying anything else. Just that same steady smile, like he was enjoying every second of this. Finally, I could see a break in the trees, the parking lot up ahead. Relief washed over me. I picked up speed, practically running now. I didn't dare look back. I just kept going, focusing on the lot, on my car, on getting out of there. When I reached the lot, I didn't waste any time. I fumbled with my keys, heart racing, throwing my stuff in the back, locking the doors as fast as I could. I looked up, scanning the trailhead, expecting to see him coming out of the trees. But he didn't. The trail was empty, just the quiet of the woods, the sun starting to set, casting long shadows. I sat there, breathing hard, waiting, half expecting him to come strolling out at any second. But he never did. I don't know how long I waited there, staring at the trailhead, expecting to see that same smile, that look in his eyes that said he'd already won. But after a while, the tension faded, and I pulled out of the lot, hands shaking on the wheel the whole way down. I haven't gone back to Olympic since. It was late when I finally made it to the beach. I'd been driving all day, trying to get some distance from everything, from work, from people. Just needed some quiet. I found this spot down a winding road, tucked between cliffs, barely marked on the map. It was a wide, empty stretch of sand, nothing around but a few dark rocks scattered here and there, the waves crashing against them. I parked at the far end of the beach where there was no one else in sight, not a single other car. The sun was just starting to set, and the air was cool, just right. I took off my shoes, left them by the car, and walked toward the water. The sand was cold under my feet, but I didn't mind. It felt good, felt calm. I walked slowly, listening to the waves, watching the colors fade as the sky turned from orange to gray, then darker. I walked a while, thinking I'd go to the far end of the beach and then turn back, just to stretch my legs. After a bit, I looked back, just to see how far I'd gone. My footprints stretched out behind me in a straight line, and I was surprised by how far I'd already walked. There was no one else around, just me and my tracks in the sand, going back to where I'd parked. It felt good, having all that space to myself. As I kept going, I started to notice something strange. My footprints in the sand looked different. I don't know how to describe it at first. They were there, same size and shape, just like they should be. But it looked like they'd somehow gotten closer together. Like there were more of them, almost doubled up, like someone had been walking right behind me, stepping exactly in my tracks. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I didn't see anything unusual, just a darkening beach, the waves rolling in, my car a tiny dot in the distance. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had blown some of the sand over, making it look like there were more footprints. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked, expecting to see someone, but the beach was empty. Just me, the sand, and the waves. I told myself to keep going. The end of the beach wasn't far now. I'd walk to the end, turn around, and head back. I kept moving, ignoring the unease in my gut. Then, I stopped. I don't know what made me stop. Just a feeling. I looked down at my footprints again, and this time I noticed it for sure. There were two sets of prints, one mine and another, right next to it. They were lined up so perfectly, step for step, that they matched my prints exactly. Same size, same shape, like a shadow, following my every move. My heart started pounding. I bent down, squatting next to one of the pairs, studying them closer. It was impossible. They were the exact same size as my feet, same width, same length, same everything. I looked up and down the beach, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just empty sand stretching back to where I'd parked. I looked again, checking to see if maybe the prints went off somewhere else, like someone had crossed paths with me at some point and I'd missed it. But there was nothing. The tracks started right behind me, as if someone had just appeared and followed me exactly, step for step. I took a deep breath, tried to shake it off, and started walking back the way I'd come, heading toward my car. I kept my eyes forward, telling myself it was just some strange trick of the sand, maybe something to do with the way the light was fading. I kept moving, determined not to look back. But after a few steps, I couldn't help myself. I looked down, and my stomach twisted. The footprints were still there, right behind me, matching every single step. It was like someone was walking a few inches behind me, close enough that if I stopped, they would bump into me. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I kept going, faster now, my heart pounding. I didn't want to look back, but I could feel it, feel the presence of those steps behind me, matching every move I made. I picked up my pace, almost jogging now, my breath coming quicker, the sound of the waves drowned out by the rush of blood in my ears. When I finally looked down again, my heart stopped. There, right beside my own tracks, were those same exact prints, step for step, as if they'd been etched into the sand at the same moment mine were. I glanced behind me, expecting to see someone finally, a person who could explain this, anything that made sense. But there was nothing. Just that same empty beach, fading into darkness. I broke into a run, not caring about how it looked or who might be watching from a distance. I ran as fast as I could, toward the spot where I'd parked my car, not looking down, not wanting to see if the tracks were still there, if they were still matching my every step. My feet pounded against the sand, and I could hear the sound of my own breaths, coming hard and fast. When I reached my car, I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors, my hands shaking, and looked back at the beach through the window. The sun had almost completely set, casting everything in shadows, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, right where my last set of footprints stopped. But when I blinked, it was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, didn't want to see the beach, the sand, or the tracks that might still be there, waiting. I just wanted to get as far away from the place as possible. It's been a few days since then, and I can't stop thinking about it. I keep checking my rearview mirror when I drive, glancing over my shoulder, feeling like there's someone just behind me, close enough to touch. I've tried to explain it to myself 100 different ways, tried to tell myself it was just shadows or some strange illusion. But every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints in the sand, perfect copies of my own, following right behind, step for step. I was traveling back from a work trip, just waiting for my transfer at this train station a couple hours from home. My train wasn't due for another 40 minutes, so I was just killing time, wandering around, checking my phone now and then. At some point, I started feeling the coffee I'd had earlier catching up to me, so I went to find the restroom. The station itself was kind of run down, not dirty exactly, but worn. That restroom was empty when I went in, 3 stalls and a couple of urinals. No music, just the faint echo of a train announcement from outside. I went to the farthest stall and shut the door. I was sitting there, checking my phone to pass the time, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something poking out from under the stall door across from me. At first, I thought maybe someone had dropped something, but then I realized it was moving slightly, shifting up and down, as if adjusting. It took me a second to process, but then I saw what it was, the lens of a phone camera. Someone was recording me. I froze. My heart started racing, but I kept still, trying not to make any sudden movements. I didn't want them to know I'd noticed. I felt sick, but I stayed as calm as I could, breathing slow, waiting. After what felt like forever, the phone finally pulled back, just as silently as it had come. I waited a couple of seconds, then stood up as quietly as possible, barely touching the stall walls. I listened. I didn't hear footsteps or anything, just silence, and I thought maybe they were still there. I felt trapped, like if I opened the door, they'd be right on the other side. My mind was racing, going through every option. Should I open it fast, scare them? Or wait and see if they left first? I decided I couldn't stay in there. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out. I glanced around quickly, looking at the other stalls. Nothing. Empty. Whoever it was had left. I didn't waste any time. I went straight out of there. Back in the main part of the station, it felt safer, but I was still on edge, looking over my shoulder every few steps. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just some creep who'd gotten what he wanted and left. But even with all the people around, I didn't feel right. Then, my phone buzzed. I didn't think anything of it at first, figured it was just a work email or something, but then I looked and saw it was a text from an unknown number. All it said was, "Nice to see you." I stopped walking, my stomach turning. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, but then my phone buzzed again. "Hope you're enjoying your trip." I didn't respond. I looked around, searching faces, but no one seemed to be looking at me. Everyone was just moving along, like nothing was wrong. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and walked faster toward the station exit, thinking maybe I'd just wait outside where there were more people around. But then another text came through. Leaving already? I couldn't believe it. My hands started shaking. I'd seen enough movies to know that this wasn't a coincidence, but I couldn't figure out how they could know I was leaving, let alone what they were getting at. I didn't know if I should respond, but another message came before I had the chance to decide. You look a little nervous. It felt like a punch to the gut. That meant they were still watching. I took a breath and looked around, trying to act casual while scanning the station, but nothing. No one was paying me any special attention. I typed back, "Who's this?" I watched the screen, waiting, hoping they'd slip up and give me some hint. A few seconds later, the reply came through. "Don't worry about that. We're just having a little fun." I felt like I was going to be sick. I had this overwhelming feeling that whoever was doing this wasn't far away, maybe even close enough to see the expression on my face. I typed, "This isn't funny," and hit send. This time, there was a longer pause, and I thought maybe they'd finally given up. But just as I let out a breath, another message appeared. "Isn't it?" I didn't respond. Instead, I headed straight for the nearest security guard. He was standing by the main entrance, a big guy, older, looked like he'd seen a lot. I explained as quickly as I could, showing him the messages, telling him what happened in the restroom. He took my phone, scrolling through the texts, and frowned. "Have you tried calling this number?" he asked. I hadn't, so I pulled out my phone, dialed the number, and pressed call. It rang, but no one picked up. Just a normal ring, no busy signal, no weird noises. Just a regular, endless ring. The guard advised me to stay close to him, and he called in another security officer to help check the restroom in the station for anyone who might be acting suspicious. I stayed where I was, my back against the wall, watching them head toward the restroom while I kept looking around, nervous, but no one around me seemed unusual. Then, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I did. The text said, "You really shouldn't have done that." I looked over at the guard, wanting to show him the message, but I was frozen, staring at the screen. Just then, one of the guards walked back over to me, shaking his head. "No one in there, and no sign of anything left behind," he said, looking around. I showed him the new text. He frowned, his face getting serious. He asked me to stay put, and then both guards left to check around the rest of the station, telling me they'd be right back. Alone, I felt completely vulnerable. I kept glancing around, gripping my phone tight, looking at every face that passed by, every figure in the distance. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was over, that the guards were on it. But my phone buzzed one last time. This time, it was a photo. A picture of me, taken just minutes before, standing in the same spot by the wall, looking as lost and scared as I felt. The message with it just said, "See you around." My stomach dropped. I looked around wildly, my head spinning, my breath caught in my throat. But I didn't see anyone holding up a phone, no one pointing a camera at me, no one acting like they were watching me. It felt like every single person in that station was in on it, every face a threat. When the guards came back, I told them about the picture, showed them the message, and one of them looked at the other, nodding slightly. They told me to wait right there, then they brought in another officer. I went through the whole story again, every detail, every text. They asked for my phone and took it to the back, saying they'd try to trace the number, find out where the messages were coming from. The next train home was announced over the loudspeakers, and they advised me to board, saying they'd follow up. I didn't argue. I just wanted to leave. I got on that train, found my seat, and just sat there, looking out the window. I didn't get any more messages on the ride home, and I barely slept that night. A couple of days later, I got a call from the station security. They told me they couldn't trace the number. It was from some throwaway line that disconnected as soon as I'd left the station. They checked the cameras, but the quality wasn't good enough to make out any faces clearly. No leads, they said. It's been months now, but every time I'm out, every time I get on a train, I feel that same prickling on the back of my neck. Like someone's watching. Like somewhere, someone has a picture of me, just waiting for the right moment.